Ryuji stood in the middle of the field, his muscles tense, ready to engage the enemy. To his left was Hamada, a real brute of a guy. Coming up on his right at a fast, wicked angle was Hiroki, a demon of sheer speed. There was no time to think, Ryuji had to act decisively or it was all over. He made his move. With a couple of quick steps, he reached his goal and kicked with all his might. He watched with anxious eyes as his team's last hope sped towards the goal. It was all in vain, everything was in ruins. He was the last hope and he blew it. The opposing team's goalie knocked the ball away just before it could go in the side of the goal and the score was set. As the buzzer went off, Noguchi Ryuji and his exhausted teammates all let out groans of disappointment. It was a close game and Ryuji had the final kick of the game. His despair was crushing him, but several of his teammates told him not to worry about it. The team captain, even came up to him and told him that he did his best and that he was proud of him for that. Several of the team were shocked by that. Anybody that had been around K for any length of time knew that he didn't give out compliments often. Because of that, Ryuji started to feel a little better. It was the last qualifying game to decide which class would represent the school. For Ryuji, there were 2 more years to try, but for the captain, it was over. Captain K was a senior this year. That was the reason that Ryuji felt so bad for not getting the shot in the goal. But if the captain could look past it, then certainly, he had no right to be down on himself. After the match, Ryuji and the team cleaned up in the locker room and everyone started home. There were 4 of them who lived near the center of town and Ryuji was one of those 4. As they were walking, they were discussing the other team. Nobody on their team liked the other class team. It wasn't because of class pride or anything like that. They couldn't stand the general attitude of the other team. The other team's players were all jerks who looked down on everyone else. That was why his team wanted so badly to beat them and put them in their place. The 4 of them were laughing about the fact that they got so close to doing just that. Truth be told, they had gotten lucky to get so close. None of their team was as athletic as the other class's team was except the captain and Wataru. It was, in truth, a good thing they lost because they could have been bad at representing the school and that might have made the entire school hate them. But they could still be upset that they lost, they had earned that much. Akira was making a ridiculous face to imitate what one of the players on the other team looked like when Ryuji made that kick. They were all laughing as Akira, the incorrigible joker, walked backward, flailing his hands in a mocking gesture. In fact, they were all laughing so much that nobody noticed that they were at the intersection in the road. Akira noticed a moment too late as he started to fall backward. He could see his life flashing before his eyes. No, actually, that was the headlights of the car that was about to hit him. Just when he thought his life was over, he saw his friend Ryuji pushing him out of the way. It all happened so quickly that he wasn't sure what was going on as he lay there with his head bleeding from where it hit the sidewalk curb. Somebody was helping him sit up, it was a paramedic. The guy was asking him questions and shining a light in his eyes, but that didn't matter. The only thing he could see was the sealed bag the other paramedics were loading into an ambulance on a stretcher and one of his female classmates wailing and trying to climb into the ambulance with them. Ryuji awoke from a hazy dream feeling and looked around. He automatically knew something was wrong. This was like no place he could ever remember being in his entire life. The place where he was sitting was like an office from one of the businesses downtown. There were piles of papers on the desk and there were reams of paper sitting beside the desk. Buried amid that mess was what almost looked like a computer, but there were things distinctly wrong with it. As Ryuji looked closer at the not-quite computer, a few more details of the room stood out. Aside from the normal file cabinets that you might expect to find in this setting, there was a bookshelf. But what really caught Ryuji's eye was a crisscross latticework cabinet almost like a wine rack, but sitting in the square holes were scrolls and rolled-up maps. Then Ryuji spotted something even stranger. Sitting on top of a small side table was an odd assortment of crystals, one of which was a perfect sphere sitting on a custom-made stand. Off to the side of the table sat an open book with what looked like the spells from some anime. A couple of circles with a star inside them and writing all through it. There was more writing on the page, but either it was in a foreign language or it was at a really bad angle that made it look that way. Ruji was just about to get up and see which one of those was the case when the door of the office opened. Turning to see who was entering, Ruji got a huge shock. The man who entered the office was the strangest thing in the office. The guy had vibrant blue skin and red eyes, but what struck Ruji as the strangest was the single golden horn growing from his forehead. Another very odd part about his appearance was the weird combination of dress slacks, office shoes, and a bare hairy chest. This guy was without a doubt a Youma. The Youma walked over to sit behind the desk, glancing over at Ruji a couple of times. As he sat in his seat, he spoke. "Yeah, I know. You've never seen a Youma before. Well, don't let it bother you too much, you won't be seeing me for long. You have a choice to make about how you want to spend your next life." Ruji, hearing this, was only mildly shocked. He remembered being hit by a car after all, and very few people survive that. He was quick on the rebound though. "So I get another shot because I saved Akira's life, huh?" The Youma for his part looked a tad surprised. "I think you have the wrong idea. Heroic deeds don't matter in the least. Normally you go to whatever afterlife you have earned by the standards set by the gods of your world. Now that I think about it, there isn't a good reason that you should have ended up here since I'm not one of the gods from your world, but the fact remains that you did, so now you have a choice to make. Option 1, I reincarnate you with an epic weapon that can't be taken from you and all the skills to use it. Option 2, I reincarnate you with an epic spellbook that can't be stolen and all the magic you need to use it. Option 3, I reincarnate you with a limitless coin pouch that can't be taken from you and better than average charisma to make use of it." Ruji noticed that the Youma seemed bored, like this was just one of the thousands of tasks that he had to deal with, and looking at his desk, that was probably the truth. "Any way you choose, you get to start as an adult with your memory intact. So, what will it be? Decide quickly because I have a lot to do." Ruji thought about it logically for a second. In his last life, he had been in Japan, a country that no longer fought anybody, not since they lost to those cheating Americans like forever ago. Ruji wasn't unable to fight, but he didn't have any skill at it. Then there was the magic. Japan didn't have magic as far as he knew. If it did exist, it wasn't public knowledge, so he would be at a disadvantage there. He was also poor in his last life. His family was always scrounging money just to get by. But of the three options, he figured, the Youma seemed to be losing patience. "Hey kid, I told you to be quick. I need to do a bunch of stuff, so make up your mind already. What is your choice?" Since he was out of time, Ruji went with his instincts. "I'll take the money pouch." Whatever he was about to say to the Youma didn't matter, because Ruji found he wasn't in the office anymore. In place of the cramped office, he was in an almost wide-open plain on the side of a hill. There were a handful of tall, bare-trunked trees around. As he turned, he saw that he was within the edge of a forest. Another thing that stood out when he looked to his right was the walled city in the near distance. He could tell that he was on a hill overlooking the city a bit. There was a road leading up to the edge of the city, and the city itself sprawled across a river. There were lots of farms on either side of the city, but the city itself was in the open plain with more roads running away from it in the distance. Ruji didn't even have to think about what he would do. He began making his way down toward the city below. He could tell that it was early evening by the coloration of the sky, unless this world worked differently than his own. He had been walking for a good hour, watching his footing on the rocks and brambles so he didn't stumble. It was getting a little darker, so he was confident that it really was early evening. The city was about 4 or 5 kilometers away still, but he knew he would get there in plenty of time to get himself settled in. Just as the hill was leveling out and the forest was getting a bit thicker between him and the city, he heard a growl. Ruji stopped dead in his tracks and turned slowly toward the deeper parts of the woods. There in the deeper gloom of the trees stood a huge shadowy figure that looked to have fur all over it. He glimpsed a pair of golden yellow eyes, and they locked with his. His heart stopped and it seemed like he stood there unable to breathe for hours, but it couldn't have been more than a second. As he was standing there fearing for his life, the situation got even scarier. The form in the trees stood up, in Ruji's mind. This could be only one thing. It was a bear. He was now scared beyond reasoning. Just when Ruji thought he couldn't be any more terrified, he was proven wrong. Suddenly, the form that was previously just a vague darkness in the woods now took on a frightening level of definition. It was the definition of scary, as it lunged forward at him through the trees. It was no mere bear, but something far more dangerous. Ruji almost lost all reasoning capabilities as his mind tried to wrap around what he was seeing. It was a werewolf. A sudden snapping of underbrush in the werewolf's path brought him out of his catatonia. In a sudden leap of inspiration, he turned and did the most brilliant thing he could come up with. He ran like hell while screaming like a little girl. He was dodging and weaving through trees and running flat out. If he had had the leisure to ponder it, he would have realized that he was a little faster than he should be, but he didn't have that pleasure. Instead, Ruji was still screaming at the top of his lungs and running in a mad dash through the trees. There was a moment of sheer horror when he could not only hear the beast hot on his trail, but could practically feel it breathing down his spine. In a moment of insane good fortune, he slipped and as he was falling, he felt a set of claws rake across his arm. The next instant, he saw the huge form of the werewolf go hurtling past him and try to come to a stop, but it didn't manage to avoid crashing through a couple of saplings. The werewolf began to get back up, but he made it to his feet first and took off at top speed. It was then that he spotted the castle-like wall of the city through the woods and adjusted his sprint towards that. Ruji broke through the edge of the forest and made a mad dash towards the road and the guardhouse that he could make out there. There was a wagon approaching a bit up the road, but he paid it little mind. He glanced over his shoulder to see if he would reach the guards or if he was going to be eaten first. He almost fell over his feet but realized that the werewolf was nowhere to be seen. Slowly he came to a stop and caught his breath while scanning anxiously for the werewolf. He stood there for several minutes, hardly daring to take his eyes off the forest for fear that he would miss the monster's approach. Finally, a sensation broke through his focus, and looking down he realized that the scratch on his arm was bleeding a little and stung like mad. He used the inside bottom edge of his shirt to hold over the scratch for a minute and then wiped the blood away. Since the scratch wasn't bad, he decided not to worry about it and just go to the guards and tell them about the werewolf. He started making his way there at a brisk pace, but didn't have the energy to run. Ruji amended that thought to he didn't have the energy to run unless he saw the werewolf again. There was a short line formed up at the guardhouse awaiting entry into the city. Ruji guessed it was the wrong time of day for a long line, or maybe this was just the wrong gate. He simply waited patiently for his chance to enter the city like the rest. He noticed that some of the group entering the city now appeared to have animal-like features, and he got very curious. Unfortunately, they were too far away for him to get a good look. Everyone else in line seemed to be human. He was a couple of dozen meters away from the guardhouse when a new thought struck him. Perhaps he shouldn't mention the werewolf. He couldn't spot it anywhere and they might not believe him, or worse, they might believe him. If they did believe him, there was a chance that they might lock him up for being infected, or worse, they might put him down on the spot. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the guard speaking to him. Fortunately, he could understand the man if he could be called a man. He certainly wasn't human, or at least not fully. The guy was wearing a bulging, leather cuirass with a set of pauldrons that were dyed an orange color. The guard had a huge build with coarse bristly hair on his chin, but his most prominent features started there. He had a pair of short tusks jutting up from his elongated lower jaw. That was nothing compared to his upper jaw though. That jaw sported a flat round pig-like nose, and as Ruji looked closer, the guy even had the floppy pink ears of a pig. Ruji was so mesmerized by the odd features of the guard that he missed what he said until he repeated it. I said, "Do you have your identification tag for entry?" I know, people aren't used to seeing an orc guarding the gate, but I passed the tests to be in the guard just like everyone else. If you got a problem with it, take it up with the Baron. In the meantime, either hand me your identification or go over there and buy a new one. For whatever reason, Ruji found himself reaching into his collar and pulling on a leather cord to reveal a small silver plate with a small gold inlay at the bottom. He didn't even realize he was wearing it, much less did he know what it was. He had no idea why he grabbed it, as though he had done this 1,000 times, but it was the right response. The guard took one look at it and bowed slightly. My apologies, I didn't expect someone of your standing to be walking out of the forest is all. My behavior was inexcusable, but if you can overlook this transgression, I can assure you it will never happen again, ever. His last words were accompanied by something like a pig's squeal. Ruji had no idea what he was talking about, but the guard was practically shaking. He figured he better play along. Not to worry, I simply enjoy walking in the forest from time to time is all. Also, I wasn't concerned that you were an orc, you just seemed a bit lax for a gate guard is all. I will overlook your behavior this one time, but next time be more vigilant. There are all kinds of creatures lurking in these woods after all. That much he could personally attest to. What was that Youma thinking sending him here only to be attacked the next moment? The guard seemed to deflate a little, either from relief or from being dressed down, but he nodded nonetheless. You are right, I apologize my lord. I do need to be more vigilant when posted at the gate. I thank you for your words of wisdom and your great kindness. Ruji was quick to walk through the portcullis before the guard said anything else to him. He glanced back and the guard seemed to really be looking more vigilantly out at the woods and the road. After the way the guard reacted, Ruji decided he better stash the necklace for the time being. He didn't want to draw too much attention, since he didn't know the first thing about this world. The guard had called him by the title of my lord. If he wasn't careful, someone might question him more stringently, and his identity wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. As he walked under the grates of the portcullis, he noticed they were very rusty, as though the gate hadn't been closed in some time or at least hadn't been cleaned. The stones that were mortared together to form the wall were all covered in moss. The cobblestones of the street were sparse, and there was a lot of mud in the street where it should have been cobbled. In short, Ruji's first impression was that this town was a little on the rundown side. The smell was the next thing to make its impression. The city had a general odor of animal dung, unwashed bodies, mildew, and an overlay of spices with a few other less noticeable scents mixed in. It was utterly revolting and made Ruji look around at the people that were visible to him. For the most part, they fit the general impression that he had formed from the smell. Most of them looked utterly unwashed, and some just looked like they were practically rolled in dirt. To take his mind off the condition of the people, he looked about at the buildings instead. He noticed that they didn't remind him of any particular type of architecture. After seeing the big stone wall, he was kind of expecting to find an old European-style town, but that wasn't really what this was. All of the buildings were made of the same dark gray stone as the wall. As he got closer to one, he realized that there wasn't mortar so much as it simply looked like someone had melted all of the stones together. The roofs seemed to be made of copper or brass that had corroded over time. How very strange this place was. He shook himself. Enough with the gawking, what was he going to do now that he was here? He figured he only had maybe 3 hours until dark. Well, he could do all kinds of things, but there were some fairly standard tropes he could follow. The most used was to go looking for the Adventurers Guild. But probably the smartest would be to go to find a place to live, and something to eat might not be a bad idea, as he realized he was starving. Then he realized that the reason he was getting so hungry all of a sudden was a new smell mixed in with the rest, the smell of cooking meat. He made his way towards the cause of the smell, growing more enraptured the whole way there. What he found is a kind of market pavilion with a bunch of almost lean-to-type stalls with open fronts where people were selling all kinds of goods. In one of these half-tent enclosures, he spotted a campfire-type setup with meat skewers roasting above the open flames. Ruji wasn't normally inclined to try strange foods from places he wasn't sure of the health standards of, and this place certainly didn't fit that criterion. However, there was something that drew him inexorably toward the smell of cooking meat. As he was walking up to the front of the stall, if you could call it that, he realized he has forgotten something important. He never checked on his special gift from the god or demon or whatever class that Youma would fall into. Just as the raven-black bird-type beastman was. Turning towards him, he reached into his coin pouch expectantly. After messing with the unfamiliar sensation of drawstrings, he managed to get the pouch open. Ruji then had to spend several more seconds fishing around in the pouch to come out with its sole contents, one small copper coin. He held the copper coin up, more to simply inspect the coin than to offer it to the proprietor. The coin was roughly the size of the end of his index finger in width. It sported a single-sided impression of a stylized sun that appeared to be smashed into it unevenly. The owner of the stall was most unpleased with this gesture and appeared to harbor some resentment towards Ruji aside from the coin. "Hey fancy, can't you read? The sign says 2 small copper per skewer. I don't even know why I'm talking to you about it. Send your friends that want them to get the meat themselves, pointy ears. Go get some bread, tree humper." This last rude remark was said as Ruji was walking off. Ruji was in shock at how unprofessional that birdbrain was. He was furious about how rude he was. More than anything else though, he was astonished that he hadn't thought to check until now to see if he was the same as before. And the answer was most emphatically, no, that he was not. Ruji felt of his ears and was astonished to find that they were tall, very tall, and pointed. He was an elf? How could he be an elf? He also now noticed that he had blonde hair like some kind of foreigner or delinquent. He wondered to himself what else might be different. Just then he noticed a different stall. This one seemed a lot bigger and a lot cleaner. The stall even had a wooden sign out front that depicted a basket full of bread. When Ruji looked at the stall, he decided that the sign was unnecessary because the owner had racks of bread lined up under the awning. As he approached, the smell of freshly baking bread hit him and he decided he liked this smell just as much if not more than the smell of cooking meat skewers. When he got a little closer, he noticed the sign that showed 2 small loaves being exchanged for a small copper. He decided that he wanted to look at the offered products before he settled on anything in haste. He went to replace his only copper into the pouch only to discover that there was another copper already in the pouch. He dug it out and looked at the 2 copper in his hand before thinking to check the pouch again. As he dug his fingers around in the pouch, he suddenly felt another coin in the pouch and understanding dawned on him. The pouch was indeed unlimited, but that didn't necessarily mean it was without any effort. One had to dig the coins out of the pouch one at a time. He smiled as he placed a 3rd, 4th, and finally a 5th small copper coin with the first 2. Deciding he had more than enough money on hand, quite literally, he walked up to the proprietor, a wrinkly old crone who looked to be human enough just old. He looked over the assortment and saw that some of the items had different prices marked on them. In the end, he settled on 2 loaves of some kind of bread that looked like it had butter or something melted on top, plus a sweet roll. The old crone told him they all cost a copper each and he happily handed over the 3 copper before asking the questions that he needed to know next. As the old woman was carefully wrapping the bread in some kind of large leaves, he asked her his questions. "Say, young lady, do you mind if I ask you a few directions? I am new to this town and find myself in need." The old lady's eyes looked up in surprise at his choice of words. After a second, she chuckled at the flattery and responded. "Oh, a young lady, am I? You golden-tongued devil you. Go ahead and ask me whatever you want, but be careful of your flattery or you may find yourself with more companionship than you bargained for one fine night." She just chuckled to herself and shook her head more as she finished and handed the wrapped bread to Ruji and stood waiting expectantly for his questions. Seeing her response, he smiled at the old lady. He had always enjoyed giving unnecessary compliments and exchanging quips with people just to get reactions out of them, and he was glad to see it still had the same effects in this world. "I was wondering if you could tell me of a cheap place to rest for the night and also where I might find the Adventurers Guild if there is one in this town?" The woman seemed to take slight offense at the last part of that, but then she just shrugged, seeing that it wasn't meant as an insult but an honest inquiry. "The guild's easy, that's it over there, though to call mercenaries something fancy like adventurers is a bit much even for a flatterer like you." The old woman pointed to a big two-story building a street over, but due to its size, it could be easily seen from their current position. Then she smiled a gap-toothed smile, before continuing. The best and the cheapest place to sleep in town are the same places. You should go see my old friend, Teresa, at the old Snoring Tree Inn. It's 3 streets in that direction, but the sign is a big tree in bright green, so it's hard to miss. She has right shabby rooms, but they're clean and the cheapest you'll find outside the Baron's dungeon. She cackled at her own joke. Ruji thanked her and walked off, stuffing the end of one of the still warm buttery loaves in his mouth. The flavor was outstanding, and he made a note to go back there. Now that he had the directions, he would try his luck with the guild tomorrow, but for now, he wanted to see if he could get a room for the night. On his way out of the plaza, he noted several items he would like to have, but a room came first. As Ruji walked along the cross street that would take him to the inn of his destination, he began to notice that there were a lot of the smaller buildings with wooden roofs. There were a lot of different colors of dyed and painted wood being used in a variety of different ways also. Some were signs and some were columns, others were purely ornamental, but the largest supply of these colorful decorations was in the form of window shutters. All the different buildings had different styles and colors of shutters. It seemed that aside from signage, this was the way to differentiate one building from the next. After turning onto the 3rd street off of the cross street, Ruji looked up and down the street, and sure enough, he spotted it immediately. The sign was fairly large and was the depiction of a tree with hands and legs laying on its side with a pillow under its bushy head. True to the old woman's word, the sign was a vivid bright green that, combined with its size, made it stand out. Ruji walked over to it and up the 2 steps to enter the front doors directly under the sign. The 2 slope-topped doors were the same vibrant green as the sign, but looked as if they hadn't been painted as recently. The doors were set on simple lift-off hinges, made of what looked to be well-oiled iron. There were several sets of equally faded but still vibrant, green shutters on the front of the building, mostly on the 2nd story. The walls of the establishment were the ever-present fused gray stone, as were the steps. The steps looked as though they had been laid with a flat side up, before being somehow melted together. Ruji pulled on the door handle and noted that the hinges were made with a slope to bring the door back to a closed position on its own. He stepped through the door into a fairly well-lit dining hall. As he looked around, he saw that the place had 8 rough but sturdy wooden tables with 6 chairs each and what looked like a simple oil-burning lamp in the center of each. Right now there was enough light streaming in through the 3 open slope-topped windows to keep the place bright, but he figured that they would need to light the lamps in an hour or 2. As he was looking about the fairly tidy dining hall, a medium-height, slightly thick woman came over to a nearby table where a group of 5 people was eating and drinking. She had a tray laden with simple wooden tankards of some foamy liquid that Ruji could only assume was a type of beer. As she passed him, she looked at him with a smile and spoke to him. "Be with you in just a moment, sir." After unloading the tray onto the table, she bent forward to collect the small pile of copper and 1 silver coin near the center of the table. The man sitting to the left of her reached his hand up and grabbed a handful of her skirted rump, to a general chorus of sighs and groans from the men and 1 woman around the rest of the table. The accosted woman didn't miss a beat and slammed the tray down on the top of the man's balding head before admonishing him. "None of that, you old leck, and if I catch you doing that to my serving girls, you'll get worse." As the man rubbed the swelling spot on his scalp, she calmly collected the empty eatery from the table before turning back to Ruji, and he couldn't be sure, but he didn't think the smile had ever faltered on her slightly plump face. The woman, whom he now figured could only be Teresa, the proprietor, walked over carrying the tray and smiled at him. "So, what can I do for you, lad? A room, a meal, both? Well, come on, follow me over there out of the doorway." After saying that, she walked over to a bar counter with a keg sitting on top of one end. As she rounded the counter, she stepped through the archway into the adjoining room that smelled of food being prepared and set the tray down on something out of sight before turning back to face Ruji. "So, what will it be?" Ruji smiled at her in return. "I would like to know the price of a night's stay and a meal." The old woman, he coughed into his bald fist, "Ahem, young maiden selling bread in the plaza, told me that I should come here and speak to Teresa. Would that be you then?" He smiled his best. impish smile. Her mood brightened just slightly as she replied. "Ah, so old Lisbeth sent you. Well then, I guess I'll give ye a little bit of a discount. Room 6 small copper a night, and I can't go no cheaper on that, but I'll take a copper off the meal, and that'll bring it to an even large copper or 8 small copper if you prefer." She went on in a chipper mood, perhaps imagining what silly description this ridiculous elf might give other people about her. "Be sure that you get your room early on before the stragglers in the evening, 'cause it'll fill up fast in about a candlespan or so. This is the cheapest place in town to stay for the night, but that don't mean I skimp on my service, so don't you be thinking that. If you pay for the room by the 8-day, I can knock a few coppers off. Maybe I'll only charge 7 full copper for the 8-day. Oh, and tell Lisbeth thanks when you see her. And come to think of it, we need to order more bread too." The last she said in a quiet voice, as if she were talking to herself. Ruji then reached into his coin pouch and fished for the 3 coins that were in there, the ones left over after he got his bread and the one that was in there when he put them in it. Then he fished out the other 5 copper pieces, one at a time. When he had the whole stack, he presented them to the innkeeper. "I'll happily take you up on that deal. I'd like to be shown to my room, but I plan on going back out for a bit. What time is the evening meal served?" She took his coins and stuck them in an open pocket of her apron, before looking back at him. "The evening meal is already being served, but I'll probably run out of the prepared soup in about half a candlespan, so be sure you get back before then. If you miss out on the prepared meal, or if you want something that isn't part of that meal, it'll cost you extra." With her warning out of the way, she turned and yelled into the back of the dining hall, where a set of stairs ran up to the 2nd floor. "Karen, come down here for a minute, would you? I need you to do something." A moment later, a really cute girl poked her head around the corner at the top of the stairs. She had shoulder-length shaggy blonde hair, and as she bounced down the stairs, something else was bouncing too. She responded as she ran down the stairs. "Coming, I'll be right down." "Yes ma'am, what can I do for you?" As she came to a stop only a couple meters from Ruji, he got his first good look at her and was able to confirm that she was human, or that she at least looked to be. Her face was slim and oval-shaped, with pure black eyes that contrasted vividly with her pale skin and golden blonde hair. When he looked at her eyes, he noticed that she was looking him up and down at the same time. When she noticed his gaze, she blushed lightly and averted her gaze back to the innkeeper. Not that Ruji could tell, but the innkeeper had noticed the looks that each was giving the other, and grinning slightly she spoke to the girl. "I need you to take this gentleman up to room 6 if it's ready yet, and get him his key on the way. Don't be too long, I still need you down here for the evening rush, but help him first if he needs it." The young girl, Karen, nodded and walked briskly behind the far end of the counter, and then walked back around to where Ruji was waiting and handed him an old-style iron key. The owner walked off chuckling to herself while they were headed upstairs. The staircase on the inside, as well as all of the inner walls, were all made of wood. Even though it was all very worn, the entire place seemed fairly clean. At the top of the stairs, there was a hallway leading off to the right, with 2 branching hallways on its right. Karen took the first of the 2 hallways, and stopped in front of the 3rd door on the left. The doors had symbols painted on them, but Ruji wasn't sure what they meant. Judging from the context, he guessed that this symbol should mean 6. Karen looked at him with her bold dark eyes set in her pretty face, and opened the door for him with a smile. "This will be your room, sir. The privy is at the end of the hall, and there will be a bucket of boiled water, pails, and towels sat there in the morning to freshen up with. I'll wait here for a moment, in case you need anything. The evening meal is usually a stew or soup with bread and is being served already, and the morning meal is usually bread, cheese, fruit if we have it, and some kind of eggs. We start serving that as soon as it gets light out." Ruji smiled and bowed slightly, which seemed to surprise the girl, before turning and walking into the room. It wasn't a big room, certainly not as big as his room in Japan had been, but that was comparing modern sensibilities to olden ones. This room was big enough for him to reside in, and it had everything he really needed in a room. It had a small dresser with 2 drawers, a small table with an oil lamp, and a wood-framed bed. The mention of a privy worried him far more, but he supposed that there wouldn't be running water and flushing toilets in a historic setting like this. He sat on the bed and noticed that it wasn't packed with hay like he was expecting from this setting. It was fairly comfortable, just a bit more firm than he was used to. A lot of people in Japan preferred to sleep on futons on the floor, but his room had a dedicated bed with a semi-soft mattress. Everything in his home in Japan had been old and passed down, but it wasn't in bad shape or anything. Ryuji stood up and fished a coin out of his pouch, before exiting his room. "Thank you, the room is just fine. I appreciate you taking the time to show it to me and waiting on me like this." As he said that, he held out the copper coin to her. She shook her head and seemed in disbelief for a second. "That's quite alright, you don't have to give me anything, it's my job. I get paid by the owner to help the guests, so you really don't have to pay me anything." Ryuji flipped the coin into the air and turned around while it was still in the air, to lock his door. Since he didn't hear the coin hit the floor, he knew that she had caught it and continued. "I didn't figure that I had to, but I'm giving it to you anyway." With his room locked, he turned and walked out. When he thought about it on his way down the stairs, he realized that he probably wouldn't have done anything like that back in his own country for several reasons, not the least of which being because it was kind of rude to tip service persons in Japan, but also because he had never had extra money that he could just throw around. Since it seemed to happen more out of habit than actual intent, he chalked it up to his charisma bonus hard at work. The next morning Ryuji woke with a start and almost fell out of bed. There were the remnants of some kind of dream, but he couldn't remember or be bothered to care. As he looked around himself, he was totally at a loss as to where his current location was. With a sudden jolt of realization, it all came flooding back to him. He was no longer in Japan but in some foreign world where he was an elf and had been attacked by a werewolf on his first day here, and this was the inn he was renting. As he laid back down in the somewhat comfortable bed, he began remembering all of the events of the previous day and the event that started it all. He was hit by a car and died, so this really was his reality now. How strange to find that it's all real, and it's not like it could be some trauma-induced coma, because he could remember traces of a dream. If he could dream, that meant he was unconscious, and now he was awake, so this had to be real unless it was one of those dreams you only think you woke up from, but that seemed less than likely. After coming to terms with his situation, he began thinking about the girl he met the day before and how cute she was. After a couple seconds, he realized that his pants were feeling tight and looked down at the bulge under the sheet. He spent the next couple of minutes making it go down. After he finished, he put his leather belt and his plain if nice cotton shirt back on, but he realized that there was a big bloodstain near the bottom. He then looked at his arm and was astounded to find no trace of the scratches from yesterday. With that done, he took himself to the privy at the end of the hall and got himself a little more presentable. The stain wouldn't come completely out, but that was fine, since it would be tucked into his pants anyway. Before leaving the room, he secured his 3 coin pouches to his belt and filled the non-magical ones with copper from the dresser drawer. He did the calculation and he figured it up quickly. 8 days times 9 small copper per day of regular priced stay brought it to 72 small copper coins. So he put that in one of the pouches, and the other he just filled up about halfway. On his way out the door, he locked it behind himself and secured the key to his belt with the leather thong on it. He made his way down the stairs, thinking how odd it was that the people here seemed to use a base 8 counting system. He decided he would ask about that at some point, but he had other things to take care of first. As he got to the bottom of the stairs, he saw that the dining area wasn't nearly as crowded as the night before, and there were a few tables completely empty. He quickly took a seat at a nearby table and began looking for either the owner, Teresa, or Karen the serving girl. After a few seconds, the older Teresa came out of the kitchen carrying a tray with some bowls on it and stopped in front of the table just down from him. As she was unloading the bowls onto the table in front of her other guests, she looked over and acknowledged him. "I see ya, dearie, I'll be over there in a blink." True to her word, it didn't take her long at all to arrive in front of him. "Alright then, this morning we have a choice of foods for breakfast thanks to you. Normally we don't have fresh bread left for breakfast, but since you went and bought so much, I made up a batch of butter and a batch of yogurt. I even managed to get some fresh berries to go in it. So what'll it be? Or I can just bring you some of each. You know, you didn't have to spend any money outside the inn, that's not what I meant for you to do. If you'd just told her we needed more bread, she would have brought the bread and I would have paid for it. Ruji just smiled at her. I'll have the buttered bread and berry yogurt then, but not too much. I will probably be moving around a lot and I don't want to lose my breakfast. Also, I want to pay for my room in advance for the next 8 days as we discussed. As he said that, he untied the plain coin pouch from his belt and opened it, appending the contents onto the middle of the table. The sight of someone doing this made Teresa's eyes go wide for a moment, but she regained her composure quickly. As she began gathering up the coins that had spilled to the edges of the table, she chuckled out a reply. A bit showy, I see. It would have been more practical to just use bigger coins, but that's no matter. I'll get your food after I get 'em all tucked away. How many is this? There are 72 coins in the pile, and thank you for the meal. Teresa scratched her head and gave the puzzling elf sitting in the wooden chair a sidelong look. He was more than a bit odd when she thought about it. He had come to her on a recommendation, so she gave him a discount, then he spent extra money at old Lisbeth's stand to get the bread they needed, and now he was putting down more money than they had agreed upon for his lodgings. Just what was he up to, she wondered. If he were rich, he could have stayed in any of the inns in the nobles' district, so why was he here? Maybe he was just trying to look rich to the people around here, but then he also didn't really act like that kind of person either. She decided on one more question just to try getting the info she wanted. That's more than we agreed upon. What are you after? Ruji knew that he was making her suspicious, but he still felt that a fair price needed to be paid for a fair service. It was a little strange to other cultures, but the Japanese people all had a firm belief in fairness and honor instilled into them from an early age. There were always exceptions, but overall, they were more honor-bound than not. I know that you were trying to give me a discount, but that's simply no way to run a business. You have to make money to get by, so there isn't really a reason for me not to pay a set price for a decent room. That's all. If you don't need the money, then give it to Karen instead. I don't mind either way since the money is yours now. Teresa chuckled and scratched above her ear. Well now, you got me there. Well, since you'll be staying a while, what's your name and should I actually be addressing you as m'lord? This last part was in a hushed tone that wasn't likely to be heard by anyone else in the dining area, even in the relatively quiet atmosphere of the morning conversation. Ruji panicked for a second. Nobody up to this point had asked for his name, and he could tell that his name would be strange in this world. He was also unsure if he was supposed to already have a name, and if he did then he couldn't very well use his old one from his past life. In the end, he didn't have a choice, but he could at least come up with a clever explanation for it, but what? After a few seconds of Teresa looking increasingly more uncomfortable, he had an idea. I'm sorry, but I can't answer you truthfully, because I just don't know. I don't remember my name or much else about my past. Pretty much the only thing I have are the past few days, and what I had on me. Why don't you call me Ruji? A bird was screaming something like that when I awoke in the forest the other day. It sounded like it was trying to wake me up, so I'll just use that as my name. Teresa's eyes got wider the more Ruji said, then they narrowed near the end as though she wasn't sure if she believed him or not. She pondered that for a second, then shrugged and went to the kitchen. A few moments later, Karen came out of the other door with a tray and walked over to Ruji's table and began setting his bowl of yogurt and a plate of buttered bread on it. She smiled at him with a little bit of a puzzled expression and seemed hesitant before speaking. Sir, why did Teresa tell me to ask your name and see what I thought? Is there something wrong? In response to her question, Ruji told Karen the same thing he told Teresa, but near the end, he changed it up a bit. So I was thinking about calling myself Ruji because this bird was screaming that when I woke up and it sounded like it was calling my name to wake me, but that's kind of silly. You can both just call me whatever you want to, I won't know if it's right or wrong, so I suppose I really don't mind either way. Suddenly she was hugging him and seemed to be crying. He began to feel really guilty and considered telling her the truth, but she picked her head up and looked him in the eye before he had a chance. I don't know a lot about Sun Elf names, but I think that Ruji suits you well. I really don't care what anybody else thinks, I think it's a wonderful name. But if you actually don't like it, then I can talk to Teresa, and we can try to find out what a normal name would be. Wait, have you tried finding out about your past? He just shook his head no. He was left fairly stunned by her concern for him and a bit embarrassed by the fact that such a pretty girl was so worried about him. It was such a shock that at first, he didn't even register the fact that she was now sitting in his lap while talking to him. When he realized, he turned his face to the side in embarrassment, and that's when he noticed the other people in the dining room looking at them, particularly the men. All of the other people, including the women, wore one of two kinds of faces. Either they were glaring at the two or they had grins on their faces. The women all seemed to be fixated on Karen, and they almost all wore scowls, while the men were fairly evenly split between scowls and grins. As he did a quick glance, he even saw one of the guys who was giving him a grin from across the room suddenly gave him a thumbs up and winked. Ruji had to blush at that. Karen must have noticed, because she suddenly jumped up and stuttered out an apology. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." After trailing off, she grabbed the tray off the table and rushed back to the kitchen. As Ruji looked around the dining hall, most of the other patrons had averted their gaze, but he caught one person still smirking at him, Teresa. Ruji felt a bit awkward after that and ate his meal with his head down. Even though he couldn't work up the courage to tell anyone, he thought to himself how good the food was even if it was a bit strange. It wasn't at all like the foods he was used to eating for breakfast. From Ruji's perspective, he had just had a normal Japanese-style breakfast prepared by his mom only the morning before. He thought about the differences as he ate, like how the meal his mom made was 5 small dishes or the fact that none of them included his favorite, bread. Another really strange thing he realized he would probably have to get used to was that there was no rice, it probably didn't even exist here. He finished up his meal and quietly set his dishes on the end of the front counter where all the other patrons were stacking their own. He then left the inn in a bit of a hurry for a couple of reasons. The main reason was that he was excited to try his hand at becoming an adventurer and going on adventures. Mercenary, he corrected himself. The other reason was out of embarrassment, and that one was the reason he was in such a hurry to leave. Once he arrived at the market plaza, he had visited twice yesterday, he began looking around at the rooftops. He spotted the tall jutting roof that had been pointed out to him the previous day almost immediately. From the angle he was seeing it, he decided that it couldn't be but a couple streets over at most, so he set off. Already, a few people were wandering around the market shopping. As he was passing by, he spotted Lisbeth setting up her stall for the day. She was placing the last of the baskets of bread on top of the others. He decided to go by and tease her with a bit more flattery before going to the Mercenaries Guild. As Ruji walked up with a smile, he started in on his flattery. After all, he did owe her for helping him yesterday. "Good morning, young lady, and how are you doing today?" Lisbeth, who seemed to be lost in thought and staring off rather than finishing her preparations, visibly jumped from being so startled. "Oh, it's the young golden-tongued elf. The one who lied to me about an order and paid for it himself. What would bring you to do that, youngin'? I just can't figure it out and it's been driving me crazy." Ruji chuckled before answering. "I didn't have a real reason, I just wanted to help out. I do that from time to time. Remind me later on and I'll buy bread for the homeless and orphans too." Thinking that she was being mocked, Lisbeth's face clouded over in anger. "Oh, will ye now? And just how much will ye buy for them then?" Ruji, missing the look on her face as he was turning to leave, answered in a light and jovial tone that was somehow disarming enough to convince her of his sincerity. "Oh, not much. Probably only about as much as I bought for the inn. See you later, then, and thank you for helping me yesterday." He waved behind him without turning as he walked towards the next street. Ruji wasn't in a particular hurry, but he was excited to get there. He turned the street corner and as he walked a bit farther down the lane with his boots partly sinking in the mud, he began to notice a flow of people. They were all turning at the next street over. He looked at the rooftop and confirmed his suspicion. That was going to be the street that the Mercenaries Guild was on. Then that would make all of the people he was seeing around him headed in the same direction, either mercenaries or people posting jobs. When he looked closer at them, he noticed that a lot of the people were turning the corner ahead from both directions. They were a collection that looked like they were going to some comic convention, as he saw advertised on TV. Everywhere Ruji looked, there were people carrying weapons and dressed in armor. There were also a bunch of people who, much like himself, were dressed in nice clothing. Those must be the people here to have a job handled. He also saw a couple of people, one guy and one girl, dressed in similar uniforms that he assumed must be guild employees. Once he turned the corner, he got his first good look at the building and something occurred to him. The guild hall looked like a Christian church from back home in his town. Ruji never went into the church, but he saw it many times in passing, and that was the general look this building had. It had a tall, steeply angled roof, with a small tower at the front that had a bell in it. It was also made of stone, just like that church. The only thing that it was missing was the tall picture glass windows and the cross on top of the bell tower. This building had what looked to be arrow slits, instead giving it a much more intimidating feel. As Ruji got closer, he could see that the place had two massive wooden doors that were currently wide open to allow for the traffic coming and going from the building. The doors were under a slight overhang, and as Ruji passed under it, he spotted another feature. The overhang had covered holes leading up, those were called murder holes. People defending this building could pour hot oil from them or shoot bows through them. This place was an old fortress that had been converted at some point in the past, as evidenced by the difference in the stonework of the building and its design. Once he stepped through the front doors, Ruji was accosted by the smell of alcohol, sweat, and body odor. The inside of the building was very hot, despite the doors being wide open, because of all the people going in. Another thing that struck him was the ambient level of noise within the building. It had to be hard for the staff to hear each other, and also the people that they were trying to help in all that noise. As Ruji walked further into the building, his eyes adjusted better to the lower level of light. Slowly a few things became clear as his eyes adjusted. First, he could now identify the source of the alcohol smell, because there was an entire wing of the guild hall that was devoted to a tavern for the mercenaries. It made a bit of sense for several reasons. The main reason was that it would be good stress relief to tired mercenaries who just finished a mission, but also it made a good meeting place for both parties and for clients. Then there was the fact that the guild could use the tavern to reclaim some of the money they paid out for missions if they provided the entertainment that those same people were going to spend it on anyway. The second thing that became apparent to Ruji as he looked around the guild hall was that he was going to have a hard time doing most of the things he wanted to do here. As Ruji looked around, he saw several signs, but he couldn't read the language at all. That was going to be a major hindrance to his plans. For now, he needed a good cover story, but he would need to learn the language as soon as possible. As he looked around, he was being jostled by the people behind him, trying to get to their destinations. Ruji spotted some benches against a nearby wall and made his way over to them. As he sat on the bench, he was only able to observe the areas of the guild hall between people, but it was enough for him to get a general idea of the place's layout. There was a wide open area the entire width of the building just inside the doors. After a few wooden posting boards and some benches against the walls, the area began to split into different sections. On the right side next to the bench that Ruji was sitting on was the entrance to the tavern. Opposite that was a row of counters where guild employees stood helping lines of customers. Between the two in the center of the hall was a broad flight of stairs leading upwards, and more people were coming down from there than there were going up. Ruji guessed that the second floor must be for higher-level mercenaries, or perhaps housing of some kind. Behind the stairs on either side was a wall with a door leading further back into the guild building. The entire setup was well laid out and everything went fairly smoothly. Ruji could see that there were some unruly people here and there, but for the most part, everyone was just there to take care of their business and move on. With a bit of anxiety about the whole situation and a little more about the language, Ruji got up and made his way toward the counters. As he approached the counter area, He saw that there were several counters and that the lines for each were fairly long, but there were a couple on the far side of the lines that didn't have many people in them. As he looked closer, he noticed something else about the people in the longer of the lines. Most of them were holding slips of paper or parchment. The people in the shorter lines were not, and that led Ruji to believe that the shorter lines might be for signing up while the longer ones were for quests. As Ruji approached the two shorter lines, he chose to stand in the longer of the two. That would give him a little longer to come up with a reason that he couldn't read. Not being able to read was probably common enough, but probably not to those who looked like nobility. Since he couldn't pretend to be a barbarian, he considered the possibility of telling them he was from another country, but decided against that rather quickly. As he got right up to the counter, he ran out of ideas and just decided to say he forgot how. The clerk behind the counter was a young boy about 12 years old. At first, Ruji was surprised by this, but then it occurred to him that this was a low-tech culture, so the age of adulthood was probably lower as well. He was wearing the same uniform as the rest of the clerks, so he had to be an employee, and he had helped the people in front of Ruji, so he knew his job. There was no reason not to trust his capability. The slightly tan and rail-thin boy looked at him with eyes full of enthusiasm poking out from under a drape of light brown hair and spoke in a clear and practiced tone. "How may I help you today? Are you new to the guild and here to register?" Ruji decided to play the confused victim card, because he didn't really have much else he could do. "Well, yes? I think so anyway, but you see, there are a few problems. I don't remember my name for one. When I woke up outside of town, I just came in as quickly as possible and got a room for the night. For all I know, I may already be a member of the guild. One more thing that is more troubling than that, I remember how to count but I can't remember how to read." The boy looked at him with wide eyes for a moment, before the next guy in line coughed and brought him around. "Okay sir, I'll ask you to stand over there by that door, and somebody will be out in a minute to get you." Ruji did as he was told. As he was walking away, the boy yelled next and the line shuffled forward. Ruji stood at a door next to the clerk's windows and waited. He wasn't sure whether the boy had believed him, but he knew he had no alternative if he wanted to join any guild. It didn't take long before the door opened and a cute girl stuck her head out and motioned him to follow her inside the back of the registration area. They made their way to a small room in the back where she asked to see his guild pendant or his identity pendant. He looked at her with a puzzled expression, so she pulled out a necklace with a small iron pendant on it, and as he looked at it, he could tell it wasn't like his. He felt around on his neck and pulled out the necklace and held it up with a blank expression. The moment the girl saw it, she got a worried look on her face. "You say that you don't remember anything?" Ruji nodded his head. "Would you mind if I took a look at that for a moment?" He wasn't sure what she was about to do, but if she were to try to swipe it, then what could he do? He shrugged and handed it to her, and she examined it carefully before pulling out a weird device that could only exist in a fantasy setting like this. It was a pair of large crystal clusters with a thin crystal sheet between them. She set the device on the table in the room and put the pendant on one corner of the screen. She waited for several seconds as lines of information moved over the screen. The moment it was done, she looked at him with surprise written all over her cute Western-featured face. "Sir, what did you say your name was?" Ruji got the feeling that this might have been a mistake. "I don't know. I've been calling myself Ruji after a bird call I heard when I woke up, but I have no idea what my actual name is." "Sorry." The perhaps 16-year-old girl shook her head and motioned him over with a slender arm. "I think that the magic of your pendant has been distorted in some way. I've never seen anything like this." As the girl said the last part, she placed his pendant back on the corner of the screen, and what Ruji saw shocked him, though he did his best to hide it. Fortunately, the girl was watching the screen and not his face. What followed was a series of documents. First up was his birth certificate from the hospital in Shibuya, followed closely by his graduation papers from each of his schools, and finally, by the awards that he got in various classes. As the last of these documents scrolled by, the girl looked at Ruji again and asked the million-yen question. "Do you know what any of that is? I've never seen personal documents like those." I also have no idea what that weird language is all about. Even though Ruji knew what each one said and what they all were, he couldn't say so. No, as I said, I can't seem to remember how to read, and I can't read that either. I can almost remember what some of the signs around the lobby say, but it just won't connect. So what do I do now? The girl, who was wearing the same uniform as the rest of the employees, brushed her light golden hair aside as she looked at his pendant in front of her and brought her hand to her chin and thought. She was a little shorter than him when he was human, so she was a full head shorter than his current body. She thought for about 10 seconds, before seemingly reaching a decision. As she turned to him, she put on a bright smile that seemed to light up the room, but there was something else in that smile that he couldn't place. Okay sir, Ruji, was it? An odd choice for a name, but I've definitely heard stranger. Well, I guess that this means you'll be needing all new documentation, but I must say I'm surprised that they didn't do this at the gate entrance. Now before we proceed, I need to inform you that there will be fees involved for the documents as well as for my services. Suddenly Ruji was able to place that look, the same look that certain pretty girls got when talking to the richer boys at his school. That was a look that said please be my meal ticket, not that Ruji minded because he would have plenty of money for anything he wanted to do. So trying not to be too flashy about it this time, he pulled out the half-filled pouch. As Ruji looked at the receptionist at the Guildhall, he smiled and opened his pouch. I have a bit of money and for some reason, I can remember how to count. All I have on me are small copper though, so if the fees are too much, I'll need to go back to my room and get more money. I hope it's not more money than I have. The girl shook her head and began to sum up all the various fees. All said and done it would be just a little over 3 large copper, and Ruji then paid her and gave her a little extra for her help. As he told her that, she blushed and rushed off to get the documents that would need to be filled out. A few moments later, she came back with a few papers and began to fill them out in his stead. When the time came for him to sign, he wasn't sure how to proceed, so the girl sounded his name out and showed him what that would look like as a signature. What she wrote looked like nothing so much as a broad wavy line with a couple dots and a straight line above it. So having, at last, a signature, he did his best to reproduce what she had written down for him. She told him which document was the city registration form and which one was the country registration form. Finally, it came to the guild registration form and she began asking him what type of weapon he used. That was a problem, because he didn't have one. She told him that ownership wasn't an issue as long as she could put down what type he preferred, but he had no idea. She decided to finish the rest of the stuff up before proceeding with the guild registration. Okay, I'm just going to replace the stuff in your pendant with these documents. It'll only take a second. All I have to do is set the crystal lens up for it and wave it above these documents. Ruji stopped her. Is there any way that you can put those documents in before the others? I just somehow feel that there may be something important about those things already in my pendant. She smiled and told him it wasn't a problem. Just like that, she waved the screen above the papers and they were recorded on his pendant. She told him she would scan the guild paper into it later. She then led him out the door he entered and through one of the ones on the back wall. The area on the other side was mostly wide open space, with dirt floors even. She explained that this was the guild's training area and that he would need to try out some of the weapons and figure out which ones he was good with since he couldn't remember. She first led him over to a long narrow spot marked off to the side of the indoor field. This one had some targets set up at various distances down its length, and he understood that this was the archery range. Ruji had seen some of these that were used by the archery club out behind the school, but he wasn't part of that club. A lithe young man, who also appeared to be an elf, came walking up and greeted them. Oh, good morning, Reina. What brings you to this side of the wall today? Perhaps this young man? Hi, my name is Goldenleaf and you are? As he said his greeting, he held out his fist in what Ruji figured was some method of greeting. As such, Ruji held his own fist near the other elf who pushed his fist against Ruji's and then pushed a bit harder for only a moment before dropping his hand, so Ruji did the same. I'm Ruji. Nice to meet you. Goldenleaf looked puzzled for a moment and Ruji knew what was coming. What an odd name, where did you say you were from? And so Ruji spent the next few minutes explaining his made-up backstory. At the end of that, the other elf looked a little bit more relieved. Ah, I see. I think I know the birds you spoke of. Is the sound actually like this? He then made a strange warbling screeching noise that somewhat resembled Ruji's name. Ruji just shrugged, explaining that he wasn't good at bird calls, a somewhat weak excuse, and they quickly moved on to the testing. Ruji tried out throwing spears, daggers, and hatchets, but he was terrible with all of them. He also tried to shoot a bow, but surprised everyone by being even worse at that. As he and Reina, the guild employee who had yet to introduce herself, walked away, Goldenleaf just stared after him with a look of utter disbelief. Next, they approached a burly man in an intricate robe who appeared to be in his mid-30s. Good day, Glacé. I need you to examine this fellow for me. I'm hoping he'll have some kind of a blessing, because he doesn't have any skill with ranged weapons, and you know how Locke is. The man that Ruji now understood to be some kind of priest or cleric approached him and looked him over for a moment before standing right in front of him. He asked to see his hands, and then held Ruji's hands for a couple minutes before letting them go and looking back at Reina. It seems that he received some kind of blessing from a god, but he has the blessing himself, not the ability to bestow it, sorry. Reina sighed and thanked the man named Glacé and motioned for Ruji to follow her. They made their way over to another man that Ruji could only assume was Locke. This guy was a mountain of muscle and had a very arrogant attitude as he talked to the people around him. Even as Reina brought Ruji towards him, he began to get a sneer on his face as he looked Ruji over. This was an expression that they were both very familiar with. Ruji could tell that this man viewed most people as beneath him. Ruji knew all too many people in his high school who viewed others down the length of their noses. Once they were standing next to the guy, Reina looked up at him and put on a very fake smile before continuing. Good morning, Locke, I have a new one for you today. This is Ryugi. He's trying to apply for a mercenary license, but he didn't have any luck with any of the other tests. I was wondering if you might spare him a few moments to test his ability with a weapon. Ruji thought about correcting the girl but decided that it was close enough that it wasn't worth thinking about, and the other guy, Locke, didn't look like he paid any attention to her anyway. That suspicion was confirmed by the man's next words. What are you bothering me for again? Let me guess, you want me to train this scrawny twig. Well, come on, twig, let's see what you've got. The next moment the man was shoving a long, heavy but purposefully blunted sword into his hands and walked a couple meters away. He turned around and faced Ruji and held his sword up in one hand. It took both of Ruji's hands to hold the sword up as he faced the sneering brute. Locke looked at him for several seconds before snorting with a grin on his face. Well, come on, attack me with that sword, or do you not even know how to swing one of those? Ruji was mad about the man's taunting attitude. Suddenly he felt something within him, a fiercely burning fire that gave him reassurance. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew he could do this. He dashed forward at his fastest speed, and he was pretty sure of his speed considering he was a soccer player. He held the sword to the side and swung it in an arc at the man's exposed ribs, yelling at the top of his lungs. Ruji wasn't sure what happened next, but there was a blinding white flash and he felt a cool sensation on his back. When the white faded, he could hear laughing and the man was standing over him, shaking his head. As Ruji regained focus, he could see his sword on the ground next to him. As he started to get up, he heard a furious young girl yelling at Locke. Did you really have to hit him so hard? What if he had died? You're such an ass. Locke stood there grinning the whole time as he answered. Oh, shut your mouth, Reina. I didn't hit the pretty boy that hard, he's just weak. That's not my fault. And you, what the hell were you thinking yelling like an idiot? I almost got hit because I wanted to hide my face in embarrassment for you. If you do that when I check you out with any of the other weapons, I'm going to knock some of your teeth out. Here's an axe, see if you can hit me with that, twig. Ruji tried to swing the heavy axe at the man but could barely hold it up, let alone hit anything with it. In the end, the other man contemptuously kicked the axe out of his hands with one foot and very little effort. Next, he tried using the spear, but he didn't fare much better. It just felt so awkward to him, and Locke knocked it from his hands, with little effort. Then he tried the mace, and though it was lighter than the axe, it was still far heavier than anything that he could wield. When Locke offered him a blunt dagger, he saw the murderous grin the man had and turned it down. He already had several bruises, and his wrists and hands were numb and hurting at the same time. He knew he couldn't do anything against this man, no matter how much he wanted to. Locke just turned away and walked back toward his cronies. He stopped about halfway, and turned to look at Ruji. "Well, Twig, I guess that's about it. Too bad, I guess you'll have to try again some other time, like maybe after you die and come back as a real warrior." This got a scowl from Reyna and riotous laughter from the group behind Locke. Then after a few seconds of laughing at his own joke, he acted like he was wiping a tear from his eye and went on in a more pensive voice. "No, but in all seriousness, if that's all you can do, then you really aren't meant to be a mercenary. Just go home and be a merchant or whatever it is you're trying to avoid. You've run out of options. You don't have any blessings, you can't use any ranged weapons, and you can't use any close-in weapons, so unless you think you can convince the crazy old wizard to take you as an apprentice, you've hit the end of the line." Ruji perked up at hearing the last part about a wizard. He had almost forgotten that this was a fantasy setting, and certainly there would be magic. That was it, his ticket to greatness was waiting with this old wizard. "Well, if that's how it is, then I guess I have no choice, do I? Where's this old wizard at?" Ruji thought the laughing was bad before, but after he said his piece the men started laughing even louder and jeering him with all kinds of slander about his parentage and intelligence or lack thereof. Ruji gritted his teeth and was getting ready to rush at the closest of the men when Reyna caught him by the shoulder and turned him away from them. Ruji pulled his arm away gently and turned to look at Reyna with incredulity written on his face. What was this girl talking about? Why was she calling him your lordship? As he looked at her stunned, she went through several expressions herself. Her face started out puzzled when he stopped, then it went to something of a bored challenging expression. As she looked closer at him, she squinted in a puzzled studying expression before realization dawned on her and her eyes shot open wide while she covered her mouth. "You can't mean that you were telling the truth? You really don't know who you are? You didn't even know that you were a noble? Are you kidding me right now?" Ruji thought about the implications for a minute and the guard from the previous day came to mind. Suddenly his words and reactions made sense. If he were talking to a noble, then he would try to suddenly backpedal. Probably the last thing anyone in a feudal society wanted to do was get on the wrong side of a noble. But then how could he play along with this? He was no noble. The one thing that did occur to Ruji was that he could at least get the information he wanted this way. "Sorry, but, yeah. I really don't remember my past at all. I guess that this means I'm some kind of nobility, right?" He touched the pendant under his shirt. Well, I didn't know until now, so thank you. But seriously, I really would like to talk to the wizard, so could you tell me where to find him? I may not be able to fight, but maybe I can use magic. I'll never know until I try. I can pay you a little bit for the information if that's the issue. Reyna just shook her head a little and bowed slightly before looking back at Ruji with a smile that was so bright that he couldn't tell if it was genuine or not. "No, that's fine. If you really are that determined, I think you should know a few things before you go there. The old wizard hasn't taught anybody for over 50 years now. There have been several people who tried to get him to teach them, but he refused them all. If you are determined to ask anyway, I'll tell you how to get there. If you follow me, I'll even draw you a map so you won't have any trouble finding it." She grabbed Ruji by the hand and practically dragged him to the back of the counters again. After a couple minutes, he was leaving the guild with a map in hand. Just as Reyna said, it didn't take him but a few minutes to make his way over to the wizard's store. It was a good thing that she had given him the map though, because there wasn't anything except the sign that might give away that this was a wizarding shop and he couldn't read the sign. He made up his mind to do this already, so there was no reason to hold back. Ruji squared his shoulders and walked up the steps to the porch and opened the brass inlaid door. As soon as he stepped into the shop, it became very clear that this was a wizard's shop. It looked just like something straight out of a manga. There were 5 round tables in the shop, piled with things that very obviously belonged in this setting. One table had several mortars and pestles of varying sizes and materials, along with a type of wheel grinder that Ruji had never seen before. That table also had several powders of varying coarseness, all spread out on small leather pads. Ruji looked over to the next table in and found that it had a huge variety of liquids and oils, all in vials and bottles of varying kinds. It was a very messy display, with no rhyme or reason to it. There weren't even labels on anything. He looked around some more and found a bigger table, all laid out with candles and crystals on a tablecloth that had a classic spell circle design sewn into it. As he looks about, he noticed that bookcases were lining every wall and that they were covered in books and scrolls. When Ruji made his way around the farthest table to the rear of the shop, he could make out the figure of an old man sitting on a stool behind the counter reading a book. As he made his way closer, he could tell that the figure wasn't proportioned right for a normal human. He wasn't particularly muscular, but he still had a very wide frame and he appeared to be a bit on the short side from the upper portion that Ruji could see. As he got closer, the old man turned his face at the sound and Ruji saw other features of his face and it all made sense. With his full long beard, flat round nose, and overly wide facial features, he could now tell that this man was a dwarf. The old dwarf with a full head and beard of grey hair jumped down from the stool and walked over with a slight limp and a bored look on his face. "What can I get for ye?" "I have every kind of magic ingredient you could want for casting. Even have a bit of material for summoning if that's what you're after." "So what can I get for ya?" Ruji was caught just slightly off guard by the abruptness of the question, which left him stammering and sounding unsure of himself, altogether not the tone he was aiming for. "Well, I was kind of hoping that you would teach me how to use magic." "I was told that you were." The old dwarf cut him off without hesitating. "Not gonna happen. Like I told everyone that came here before you, I don't intend to teach anybody magic no more. Ain't nobody got any talent for it anyway, so what's the point in me wastin' my time tryin' to teach a bunch of youngins that ain't got no talent anyhow?" Ruji started to get discouraged, but then he began to feel indignant and snapped back. "Hey, you don't know whether I have any talent or not, you never even gave me a chance. The truth is that if you won't teach me then I can't get into the Mercenaries Guild. I tried all the tests that they gave me for throwing things and sword fighting and stuff, but I couldn't do any of that stuff. I also didn't have a blessing or whatever, so I couldn't get in that way, and then they told me I could try asking you to teach me magic. Please, you're my last chance at joining the guild." The old dwarf just scowled as he replied. "See, what did I tell ye, no talent. You should just give up. Sounds to me like you don't need to be in there if the only way you got left is me teachin' ya. Got no talent for any of it, I says. Now, get you goin'." Ruji could tell that the old dwarf was going to be stubborn about it, but he really did want to learn how to cast magic, and if this guy was the only one who he could learn from, he just had to be persistent. "Why are you being so rigid? It's not like I'm asking you to do it for free, I'll pay for training if that's what it takes." The old dwarf turned an angry glare on him. "Oh, so you're one of those types, are ya? You think that money can be fixin' everything? Well, it don't work that way, youngin'. I don't care how much money you gots, I ain't a teachin' ya. Not for no amount of coin, ya hear?" Ruji decided that he would give it one more shot, and if he couldn't convince the guy then he would leave and try to think of some other way to get in or just figure out something else to do altogether. "I just don't get it. You claim it's not about money, fine. You say it's a matter of talent, I can accept that. But you won't even give me a chance to find out if I even have the talent to do magic. How do you know I don't have it if you won't even give me the freaking chance? I just want a fair shot at learning magic, is that really so much to ask? You don't even have to teach me quickly if that's the issue, once a wee I mean once in 8 day would be fine if that's all you can do. Seriously, just give me some chance to learn." The old dwarf looked boiling mad and seemed like he was going to start cussing at any moment, and so Ruji started to turn to leave, but then the old geezer spoke in a dangerously quiet voice. I'll give you one chance and only one chance. If'n ye can impress me with my challenge, then I'll think about teachin' ya, but if'n you don't, you leave and don't be comin' back. We got a deal? Ruji swallowed the saliva in his mouth, suddenly feeling like he might have pushed a bit too far, but it was already too late for that. If he didn't accept the old guy's challenge, he wasn't going to get another chance anyway, so he might as well try. Okay, if I can't impress you on your challenge, then I'll admit I have no talent for it and go away. Thank you for giving me a chance. The old dwarf seemed to calm down almost immediately and then scratched his head as he looked around the shop as if searching for something. Finally, his eyes settled on one spot and he got a grin on his face, and Ruji's heart sank. He knew what was coming. The old geezer was going to ask him a ridiculous challenge that he had no chance of figuring out and would then shoo him out the door like an incompetent toddler. Alright boy, if'n ye can tell me what enough of those rocks are for, I'll consider teachin' ye. Take your time, I'll give ye half a candle to figure something out. I'll be standin' over here, so just let me know if'n any of do anythin' special. Well, get after it. Ruji walked over to a large round table covered in bowls full of rocks, ores, metals, and crystals. There were a few different ores and minerals that were sitting on small cloth patches by themselves, but not many. Any of them that were like that were in ones and twos, while the ones in the bowls were far more numerous. Ruji started to get nervous. How was he supposed to know what any given rock was used for in magic? The only time he had ever dealt with rocks was in the geology section of his earth sciences class. Oh well, since that was all he knew about rocks, he figured he might as well use that. It was better than nothing after all, and if he couldn't impress the old geezer with his half-remembered geology lessons from earth sciences class, then that was just fine. It would just mean that the old dwarf was right about him not having the required talent. Ruji looked over the rocks on the outside edge first, but he didn't immediately recognize any of them. He then began to rummage through the bowls, picking up some of the rocks here and there. As he gave several a brief inspection and placed them back in their bowls, the old man sighed. Ruji knew he needed to say something quickly. Suddenly, one bowl caught his eye. The contents were a bunch of bright yellow stones, and he quickly grabbed one of them and sniffed to be sure. Hey, this one is sulfur, this one burns with a blue flame, but I think it has to be like ground up first. I think it used to be called brimstone. Ooh, and I know what that one is too. Ruji grabbed a piece of dark silver-gray coal from another container and sniffed it, and it also had a slight sulfur smell, and he knew he had the right stuff. Yeah, this stuff also burns really well, and it burns really hot for a long time. Now let me see what else I can find here. Ruji didn't care if the old guy wasn't interested in what he had to say, he was starting to have fun. It was almost like a scavenger hunt, and Ruji was reminded of how much he had liked that particular course. Then he spotted something out of place. At first, it almost looked like a white rock with small holes in it, but Ruji knew better. Hey, this isn't a rock. This is coral, it's a shell from in the sea. Oh well, I guess it is still a mineral. It has a lot of calcium like bones do, so I guess that's probably why it's here. This one is granite. Granite is like, really hard, and it's used to make countertops and hard surfaces that won't get scratched. Oh hey, this black one here is obsidian. It's really hard, and when you break it just right, the edge is razor sharp. I cut myself on this stuff one time and I didn't even know it until somebody told me I was bleeding. I think the greenish one here is basalt. I think that you get that from underwater, don't you? It looks like sandstone, but it's not red or tan, and it doesn't have the lines in it. Also, the rough part doesn't just crumble off like it does with sandstone. Oh hey, this one is sandstone over here. I see that you have a few quartz crystals over here in this bowl. Really small ones can zap you with an electric charge if you hit them with a small metal hammer and they don't break. Oh, this gray one is slate. If it can be gotten in big enough sheets, it can be used to make roofs with, or you can write on it with this talc here. It pretty much always splits along the grain. I see you have flint. If you hit this with a piece of steel, it will make sparks that you can start a fire with. And this one that kind of looks like it is shale. I think the only thing it's used for is making brick though, unless it has oil in it. Ryuji was having so much fun that he didn't notice the dwarf's expression until he went to move around the table so he could get a better look at the metals and crystals there. When he did look over, the old dwarf was wringing his beard, with a broad grin on his face. Ryuji just stopped and looked at him in confusion. After a second, the dwarf realized that Ryuji was looking at him and his grin got even bigger. "Well, ain't that something? I don't recognize the names you called any of the stones, but ye sure did get the facts about 'em right. Okay, boy. A deal's a deal, come back in the mornin' and I'll teach ye a thing or two about magic. I ain't never seen no elf could name off a rock like that. I probably woulda taught ya if'n you only knew that coal burned in granite was hard as dragon scales. But you, well, you just kept goin' and a-goin'. I was right impressed, you got me good. Yes sir, you got me good." The old dwarf came over and slapped him in the back, but then grabbed his arm and pulled him down low so he could whisper in his ear. "Now listen here, boy. I plan on keepin' me promise, but don'tcha make me regret it. I'll be tellin' ye now, it's gonna be a lot of work. You'll be lucky if'n I give ye a day in every 8 to rest. But I guarantee that by the time you're done ye'll be a wizard more and capable of doin' anything ye want in the Mages Guild, never ye mind the Mercenaries Guild. Ye'll have parties beggin' ta have ye join 'em." As the old dwarf let him go with a conspiratorial chuckle, Ryuji just stood there stunned. He had done it, he had impressed the old dwarf with what he knew about rocks. He was going to be a wizard. The old wizard went on in a more relaxed tone. "I haven't taught anybody in a long time, so I gotta get my shit together for that. So you just come back early in the mornin' and we'll start your training then. I gotta find all the right books now, so scram. Oh, and one more thing, good job." Ryuji was in a daze, he could barely believe it. Through his small amount of high school earth sciences class, he was able to convince the old wizard to teach him magic. It suddenly occurred to him that rocks must somehow be important to magic. If that were the case, he would have to learn a lot more about them probably. As he pondered this idea, he made his way to the front door. He was just stepping through the door when he bumped into someone. As he looked down, he apologized with a simple "pardon me." What he saw as he looked was an elf that was a little shorter than him by maybe half a head. He could tell that she was an elf and female before she ever looked up at him due to her long black hair and long pointed ears. When she looked up at him, he could tell that she was a dark tan color bordering on brown. Despite her dark complexion, she still managed a blush before excusing herself into the store. As she passed him, he got a look at the rest of her and suddenly he got chills. She was wearing something of a mini skirt made of some kind of leather, but that wasn't what got his attention. Over her skirt, she had a wide belt and from that belt hung 2 gigantic meat cleavers. Each one was easily as long as his forearm in just blade length, and they looked heavy enough that they could do serious damage if you got hit by one. Since he was polite, he was fairly sure she wouldn't try to cleave his skull open, but he was in no mood to stick around anyway. He had other things to take care of. Just a moment before the door closed, the dark elf girl turned her head to look at the handsome sun elf who just walked out of the magic shop. As she looked before letting the door close, she got a brief but enticing view of his butt in the tight leather pants he was wearing. Her heart started to throb and she blushed again before quickly turning around to attend to her own business. The girl walked into the store that she had visited quite often. At this point, it was almost a custom of hers more than serving any practical purpose, but she still held out hope that one day something would change and she would get her chance. With that hope in her heart, she walked to the back of the store where the old dwarf who owned the shop was busy searching the shelf for a book. As she approached, she coughed into her hand so that she wouldn't startle the old guy. When he turned around and his gaze fell upon his guest, he began to scowl deeply, but then he did something new, he cracked a grin. The problem was that this wasn't a friendly grin, this was the kind of grin that one sees on an executioner's face at a beheading. The old dwarf made the reason for that grin apparent with his scathing words. "Ha, Miyako, no need to even ask, it ain't a happenin'. I told you before'n. I'll tell ye now, I ain't teaching you no magic. You got no talent, and I doubt that's changed in the few days since you last asked. Besides, I just found me an apprentice and this'un's got talent, let me tell ya. So just don't bother a skin from now on, you hear? Bewildered the girl, Miyako blurted out a rapid-fire series of questions in desperation. What? But when, who, how? Why did you take an apprentice all of a sudden? I've been asking you for 3 years now, how could you do this? Who did you choose? The clever old dwarf looked at her with a big challenging grin before answering. I'll do as I please. I got my reasons and you still don't have no talent, so there's no reason for you to be making a fuss. That elf that just left is my new apprentice, so there's no need for you to be comin' round no more, got it? Now get you gone, I got things to be doin'. After saying what he had to say, the grumpy old dwarf turned around and ignored the dark elf girl altogether. Miyako stood looking at the back of his head for another couple of seconds before it dawned on her that she should talk to the elf guy that just left. She rushed back out the door, and from the slight vantage of the porch she looked all around for the guy. Despite her best efforts to spot him, the guy was already gone. Miyako decided that she would look all over the city and find the guy every time she was in town, instead of out on a quest. She told herself that if she found him, that he might be able to tell her how to get an apprenticeship. It was a long shot, but she had been trying to get an apprenticeship for 3 years, so what was a little while longer? Miyako was making her way along the road leading from the village into the nearby wood. She had accepted a quest to exterminate a few wolves that were stealing livestock from farms on the far edge of this village, just upstream from town. This had been happening for a couple months, but the villagers had to have time to pull together the money to pay a mercenary to come to deal with it. She heard that they all dragged their feet until one of the villagers tried to go deal with the wolves on his own and got torn to shreds. Suddenly, the villagers were able to find the money needed to put up for a quest. That was the reason that Miyako was out here on her way to fight them. She had picked up the quest early this morning. Normally she didn't get any of the really good quests, because she liked to sleep a little too much, but this morning she was awakened by a fight in the street near her window. If the two drunks hadn't decided to noisily clobber each other over a prostitute, she would have slept a lot later. Since she was awake, she decided to get to the Mercenaries Guild early. She then had to wait for a while until the guild opened, but she was the first one in, and that got her one of the better paying quests for her rank. By that point, she was already a rank 3 first-tier mercenary, so she was able to handle a few wolves. As soon as she got to the posting boards, she found a fairly good-paying extermination quest for a pack of wolves, and had snatched it before somebody else saw it. After excitedly rushing to the counter and asking to accept the quest, the clerk looked at her with a bit of worry. Are you going to form a party to handle this? It seems like it might be a little hard to handle by yourself. Truth be told, if she had simply accepted the archer's advances, the young warrior might have had something to worry about. She wasn't interested in being the archer's nightly entertainment though, and told him so a couple of times. As they got farther from the town, he became more persistent and finally tried to force her one night. After she shaved some of his hair with one of her swipes with her cleavers, he decided to try and force her to leave the party. He expected her to come back begging not to have to walk home in the dark, but she was just fine because she could see better at night. When the party came back to the city, they found that they had been blacklisted. The archer left on his own, while the other two ended up having to find other types of work. The old cleric was recalled to the church and sent to be a village priest. The young warrior joined a caravan going to Liruis, and he never came back. They could have tried their luck as a freelance roving mercenary band, but they didn't. They could also have gone bandit, but fortunately, they chose to break up instead. For a while, she felt vindicated, but she also felt kind of guilty, and so she avoided even the idea of a party. The clerk didn't know any of that, so she couldn't blame him. No, I'll be handling this by myself. I don't want to share my rewards. It may be a little reckless, but if I do get killed then I won't come back complaining, and after a week the guild can just repost the quest. Some party can then take the quest that I failed, but until then I'm still going to try this on my own. She grinned at her morbid joke. The clerk went slightly pale, but he stamped the quest anyway. The guest details said that there were 3 or 4 wolves, but that probably wasn't right. After she got to the village, she talked to the farmers who were around the village center when she got there. There had been too many attacks for it to be only a few wolves. Also, for them to attack a human, they would have to have felt pretty confident, which meant it was a full pack of wolves. From the frequency of attacks, it seemed it might be a rather large one too. As Miyako was pondering all of this, she began to get the feeling of being watched. She knew that there was a good possibility that the wolves were deeper into the woods, but still she couldn't shake that eerie feeling. She began to look around without turning her head or slowing her pace. At last, she spotted a low shape in the woods beside her, and the shape was pacing her. It was an ambush. They were waiting for her to get a little farther in, and then they would attack from several directions. At first, Miyako panicked and almost turned around and ran, but she caught herself and calmed down a bit. If she had done that, it would have signaled that it was time to attack, and they would have run her down. She thought for a few seconds while she kept walking like she hadn't noticed. Then she spotted 2 figures doing the same thing on her right side, and she knew she had been boxed in. As she had already fallen into the wolf's trap, there was only one way she could see getting out: attack first. She gave herself a mental count of 5 and prepared the steps in her head. The moment the count was up, she sprinted to the right while grabbing the twin meat cleavers off of her belt. The thin leather thongs snapped at the sudden intense pull, and she was then holding her weapons of choice in each hand. She dashed straight at the 2 wolves on her right. The wolves were so surprised by her actions that the one nearest her yelped and jumped backward and to the side on its hind legs. That made it collide with the equally surprised wolf beside it, a fatal mistake. In one quick swing, her massive cleaver went through the mid-torso of both wolves. The nearest one got its stomach sliced open, while the one it had stumbled into got its back and ribs cleaved open. As the 2 heavily injured wolves squealed and flailed, she turned her attention to the other side. The last thing Miyako wanted to do was stay near the 2 wounded animals. Any good hunter knew not to try and finish a wounded animal, because they were the most dangerous then. She would instead give those 2 some distance and concentrate on the rest of the pack that was now trying to figure out what was going on. If she hit them quick enough and with enough force that she injured most of the ambush party, they might all run away. At that point, she could track them back to their den and finish things off. When she turned around, she saw 1 wolf coming out of the brush behind where she was, 2 coming up the path towards where she was heading, and 1 looking straight at her from the left of the path. She sprinted straight at the one in front of her. As she passed the confused wolf from behind her, she swiped at it with her left-hand cleaver and caught the very surprised wolf in the eye with the very edge of the cleaver. She was hoping for a more substantial blow, but the wolf reacted at the last second and flinched backward, saving its other eye from suffering the same fate. While the one wolf pawed at its eye and the other 2 uninjured wolves were too far away to help, she closed in on the target wolf in front of her. Finally realizing its peril, it attacked, but it was already too late. By the time it decided to lunge at the dark elf in front of it, she was already swinging her right cleaver in an upward arc. As it lunged toward her, the cleaver that it didn't notice cut into its chest, neck, and lower jaw. As blood went showering everywhere, the now injured wolf ran off a few paces, before dropping to the ground. She had severed its jawbone and an artery. It looked like that one wouldn't be a problem for long. She made a quick pivot and came around to face the 3 remaining wolves. She noticed that the 2 that came up last were very young, probably no more than a year old, 2 at the most. The problem as she saw it was the far more massive 3rd wolf, which was now sporting a big red cut through one eye. It had its remaining eye locked on her and was growling ferociously. Miyako could tell that her odds were bad. She had figured that from the outset. However, she was determined to finish this and track the remaining wolves back to the den. She was in the midst of trying to figure out a good strategy to deal with the 3 wolves in front of her. She was so focused on them that she didn't notice the wolf behind her come up. It bit her lower leg, not very hard because it couldn't get much strength out of the remains of its jaw, and it was already bleeding out. That, however, was a perfect distraction for the other 3 who attacked as soon as she turned her head. The wolves had great coordination and they had an element of surprise, but there was one problem with their attack. The three wolves in front of her were too far away to reach her in a single bound, and as soon as Miyako saw what had bitten her leg, she ignored it and turned back after catching the movement out of the corner of her eye. Her left meat cleaver she held forward with the flat of the blade down and facing the wolf pups as an impromptu shield, while her stronger right hand got her main attention, and she brought that one down at a diagonal that would make it hard for the now partially blinded wolf to see and that much harder for it to avoid. Her skill was right on point, and the next moment one of the young wolves bounced off of the left cleaver just as the right one split the older wolf's head wide open. The problem was that the last young wolf got past her and attacked her. Miyako's saving grace was that the pup was inexperienced. In its haste to attack, it grabbed the first thing it could find. Fortunately for her, the thing it managed to sink its teeth into was her backpack. She was pulled off balance for a moment, but when she managed to regain her footing, it was all over. She swung the battle axe-like meat cleaver that she used for blocking backward and caught the wolf latched onto her backpack in the flank. Her dominant hand brought the other cleaver across the neck of the other wolf as it tried to charge in and take advantage of her momentary balance issue. With most of its hunting group dead and its rear leg uselessly dangling, the last young wolf ran away from her and made its way back to its den. That was exactly what Miyako was hoping for. After wrapping her messed up leg in a roll of linen, she finished the rest of the ambush party off and tracked the bleeding wolf back to its den. The den had a half-dozen more wolves around it and probably a few more inside the actual burrow. Miyako didn't waste any time, she quickly climbed a tree with a view of the burrow and pulled out a crossbow and a dozen bolts for it. She knew she was a terrible shot, but at least if she could hit a few it would reduce the number she had to face with her cleavers. She set the string into place and double-checked all the parts again so it wouldn't break when she used it. The whole time she was doing this, she was thinking to herself about the teamwork of the wolves and wishing that she could summon monsters to do her bidding. She continued mumbling under her breath about it the whole time. If I could just summon, I wouldn't have to face everything on my own. I wonder if there's anybody in town that I could get to show me how to summon monsters. I certainly can't depend on people to watch my back. Maybe I'll go looking for a summoner when I get back from this, if I get back, that is. The next day, the villagers were astonished to find the dark elf girl walking, or rather limping into town. Her face had scratches all over it, her leg was bandaged in 2 places, she had one arm in a sling, and she had a big blood-stained cloth patch over her ribs on the right side. In short, she looked like she had gone through hell, or at least a wolf pack mauling her ass. That wasn't all that the amazed villagers had to gawk at though. She also had 3 rather unusual items on her person. She had a pole over her shoulders and on one side she had the partially eaten smoked carcass of a young wolf and on the other side, she had the pelts of 17 wolves. What they saw on her back got her the most respect though. Sitting in a net, in the open top of her backpack, were 3 wolf pups. The village quickly scrounged together an additional bonus payment to compensate for the extra wolves that none of them believed had existed till now. After the sale of the pelts and the pups, she had enough money to coast for a few months as long as she didn't splurge much. It was a good thing that she was able to take the time off because her side got infected and she was sick for a month recovering from it. At first, she wished she could summon monsters, but as her fever grew over that first week, she began to long for sentient company. The whole time she was sick, she wished to herself that she had someone, even a vile bastard like her former party member, who would stay with her while she was sick. Once she got better, she searched out the old dwarf wizard and began pestering him regularly to teach her magic. He told her, repeatedly, that she had no talent, but she kept asking. He even told her that he knew caster magic, not summoner magic, but she brushed it off as trivial and she didn't believe that he didn't know both anyway. Then one day she found the focus of her attention shifted. Suddenly there was somebody who the old dwarf had recognized as a talent in magic, and better than that, he was also cute and polite. It was just a bit before lunch on the second day so Ruji decided to go get some of the delicious bread but first, he wanted to get a meat skewer. He was craving one of the meat skewers and had been for the whole day. He went to a different stand than the one the previous day because the guy there was an ass and was racist. Even though he was never able to do anything about it, Ruji had never liked people that acted out of prejudice of any kind. At his school he was one of the first students to welcome any new student and was always quick to try befriending any foreigner. He just felt it was the right thing to do. Once he found a stand selling the meat skewers, he bought 2 from the young boy there. He then went in search of Lisbeth's bread stand. She looked at him kind of odd when she spotted the meat skewers, but she didn't comment. Apparently, the elves of this world didn't or couldn't eat meat. He thanked her and paid her, all the while calling her young lady. For all he knew, elves lived to be 10,000 years old, so in this world, he might actually be older than her even if he was only in high school back in Japan. Lisbeth just smirked at the cheesy attempt at flattery. Ruji then walked into the crowd a bit so that nobody was paying him any attention. He made a tear in the top of the bread and stuffed one of the skewers inside of it before removing the thin strip of wood from it and closing it up. Now he could walk around enjoying his meat while still looking like an elf enjoying their bread. Ruji hoped that the meat wouldn't prove poisonous somehow, but he just couldn't resist the craving for meat. The next thing on his list was looking for supplies that he might need for living in this world. He, at the very least, wanted to have a change of clothes. He began looking around the small market area and quickly made his way to the back corner where a familiar-looking cat person who had dark gray fur with aged white spots was sitting on a stool under the awning of his lean-to-style shop. The old cat recognized him from the previous day and waved to him as he approached. He looked around the shop, but it was mostly just accessories. Pouches, bags, purses, and the like. He also found that the old cat had a good selection of hats, cloaks, and capes. He then came across a very curious item in the very corner of the stand. It was like a large canvas cloak with a pole sewn into the bottom hem and sticking out on both sides. Ruji asked about this odd-looking contraption, and the stall owner looked at him sympathetically before giving his answer. This item is mostly for women, but once in a while, a guy buys one. It's a washing cloak. You put the cloak on and it has a stiff collar with a wood neck piece in it to keep it on your shoulders while you move. The pole at the bottom is flexible enough that you bend it into a hoop and tuck the ends into the opposite side of the cloak bottom. Once you do that, it looks like a bell over you, and since it stands away from you, you can take your clothes off and wash yourself without anybody seeing you. Apparently, a lot of humans and elves as well as a few other species are ashamed of their bodies and don't want anybody to see them, so they use this to bathe in towns and such. Ruji was fascinated by the idea, and then something struck him. Does that mean that people other than those will bathe in the open? There aren't any public baths in town? I'm guessing that cat people bathe in the open? The old cat eyed him suspiciously, with his slitted pupils narrowing a little. You must not be from around here. We generally do, but don't go getting the wrong idea, it's not like we bathe each other with our tongues. We're not animals, you know. We just don't get hung up on privacy like humans seem to. But a big part of that might be that we tend to have less space to live in than humans do. I live with 2 of my daughters and their husbands and children in our home. With 9 people in the same house, we don't get to have much privacy, but it's not like anybody actually needs it that much. After that exchange, Ruji bought a satchel similar to what he was used to carrying for school. He had a plan. He figured that with something this size, he would be able to carry a large number of small copper coins to a bank and get them exchanged for larger coinage. He had already noticed that a lot of the items in the plaza had prices near them. After he confirmed the price of the pouches, he now knew what some of the number symbols were. It seemed that by using those, he was able to figure out the symbol for small copper, small silver, and large silver. He was going to have to do some exchanging soon, because it would be too odd and too cumbersome to pay for more expensive items with only small copper. After thanking the old cat person for his time, Ruji left his shop and walked around the plaza. Looking for clothing. He found a lot of interesting things, but no clothing nor any shoes. He also found a couple of vendors selling weapons, but almost no armor to speak of. Since he was curious about this, he stopped back by Lisbeth's bread stand and asked her about the lack of clothing. She explained that clothing had to be fitted to the person wearing it, so there weren't many people who sold clothing in the plazas and bazaars. Ruji thanked her for the information and asked about the location of a clothier. It turned out that the commerce district was almost all the way across town. He thanked her again and was about to leave when he remembered something else that he wanted to talk to the old baker about. He paid her to bring another shipment of sweet bread to the inn that evening, and this time he didn't bother claiming it was from Teresa. He asked her about the possibility of putting nuts or fruits in the bread dough, and she told him it was too pricey for most people, so he paid her more for the nuts and fruit to go in some tomorrow. She grinned at him and told him to be off before he spent his entire fortune on bread. He left in high spirits and was even happier that he could eat his meat without anybody being suspicious. He was just finishing the second meat bun when he realized that he seemed to be in the wrong place. He looked around and all he saw were houses, and a lot of the people in the houses didn't look too friendly. He had just made up his mind to go back the way he came when 3 guys called out to him from behind. "Hey Pointy, you lost? We'll help you find your way, you just gotta pay us for it." When he turned, he saw that the 3 looked like complete thugs right down to their grins, the kind of grin that says payday. The tallest of the 3 was the one that spoke first, but now the brawn chimed in. "Hey, didn't you hear us? Give us your money, or you're gonna get hurt. Hurry it up." Ruji didn't think twice about it, he didn't even blink or turn. Without any hint of what he was about to do, he bolted backward and turned mid-run as he dashed away from the thugs. As he did so, he noticed that there was nobody left but him and the thugs on the street. He didn't bother thinking about that, he simply looked for a good alley to dash down. He turned down one alley onto another street, he only stayed on that one for a short before running down another alley. He dodged and ducked down a bunch of different paths, but he heard the thugs hot on his tail. After a couple minutes, he didn't hear them anymore and turned to look behind himself. He couldn't see the thugs anywhere, but he kept backing up anyway, and just as he turned around, the tallest of the thugs came around a corner ahead of him, and as soon as he saw Ruji, he ran straight toward him. Ruji turned and headed back in the other direction, but the middle thug turned onto the street in front of him. Ruji ducked down another alley and looked behind him to see how far away the 2 thugs were. Almost immediately, he crashed into something in front of him. Before Ruji knew what had happened, he was falling. Then he hit the water and sank to the bottom in a splash. When he came up for air, he was spitting and gasping for air. Once he finally realized what was going on, he began to swim properly and could tell he was in the river that ran through town. There was a fork in the river ahead, so he swam for the branch he was closest to. Once he was past the branch, he was swept under a bridge. Just a bit past the bridge, the branches of the river converged again. He began looking for a way to get out of the river. After going with the flow of the water for a minute or so, he spotted a set of steps on the far bank of the river. Ruji turned and started swimming against the current with an angle towards the far bank. It took him a couple minutes to make it across the river because it was pretty strong here. Finally, he made it to the far bank and the steps out were just behind him. He drifted the last few feet to the steps and crawled out. Ruji could see that the steps led fairly deep down into the river and there were poles on the side so you could grab them if the current swept you off your feet. He wasn't sure what this place was for until he spotted a basket of laundry a little further up on the bank. After crawling fully up on the bank, he laid down on the sparse cobblestones to catch his breath. As he was laying with his eyes closed just breathing, he heard someone come up. He opened his eyes, and to his horror, it was the 3 thugs. They looked exhausted and mad. Without a word, the tall one launched a kick to the side of Ruji's head. He blacked out for a moment, but was brought around by the sudden flare of pain in his ribs. After he came to, he tried to get away, but it seemed the big thug was standing on his arm. He put his other arm over his face, and the other 2 thugs kicked him repeatedly. After a dozen or more kicks to the ribs and shoulders, the thug stopped and he felt one of them pulling his coin pouches off. The other one was opening his satchel. "Hey, this damn thing is empty." The middle one was rifling through his satchel, so that must mean the tall one was taking his coin pouches. "Hey shitface, why ain't you got no more cash than this?" What the hell were you running for, you broke-ass bastard? After stealing all of his coin pouches and insulting him, the three kicked him some more before leaving. Ryuji just lay there for several minutes wincing in pain. Finally, he made up his mind and got off the ground. Several people were looking at him from the shadows of the houses around the area. Most of them were just kids, but a few women peeked at him before going back inside. Ryuji didn't mind, that was a very Japanese mindset as well. Most people in Japan wouldn't get involved in somebody else's disputes and didn't want to get tangled up in their business. He was used to that, and they probably didn't want to offer any help because they were afraid he might take advantage of them. It was okay as far as he was concerned. He was going to be okay for a bit. He had his stash of money in his room, and he had already paid for room and board for a week, or the local equivalent anyway. He knew that the money he had could hold him for 3 or 4 more 8 days of stay. Honestly, he figured that if he asked nicely, that Teresa would probably take pity on him and let him stay a little longer even. But he didn't want to be a burden, so he would need to find work within the time that his money lasted. He was glad that the thugs had at least left him the satchel. They took the full coin pouch and his infinite coin pouch and only left him the empty blue one. Well, at the very least, he had earned an apprenticeship to the old dwarven wizard, so he should be able to make a little money at least. Honestly, things weren't looking all that bad. Sure, he was sore, and he was going to be even more so in the morning, but he already had a lot going for him. He also realized that he was lucky the thugs didn't find his ID pendant. After all, it was silver and gold. Ryuji figured that after finding his coin purses so empty, the thugs probably didn't see any need to look at his pendant. They would never have believed that he was a noble, not that Ryuji really did either. But at least that was still in his possession. Who knows what kind of mischief the thugs could have caused him if they had taken that. Ryuji made it back to the inn pretty much without incident. He didn't know where he was going, but he finally found the city wall and followed it till he made it to the entrance, and from there he knew his way. When he got back to the inn, he went straight upstairs. As soon as his door was closed, he flopped down on his bed. He was intending to relax until it was time for the evening meal, but he happened to look over at his drawer and noticed that it was empty. Suddenly Ryuji jumped to his feet in a panic. He'd been robbed twice today. Realization struck him harder than the thug's kicks. If he didn't have his stockpile of coins, then he was going to have to find a way to make money sooner than he thought. He didn't have time to be lying around, he had to get out there and get a paying job. The old dwarf said he would teach Ryuji, but he never actually said he would pay him or anything. He dashed out the door of his room and didn't bother to close it because he was in such a rush. He stumbled on the stairs and slowed down a bit. Then he looked around till he spotted Teresa on the other side of the dining hall, and he made straight for her. He didn't run because there were other people in the dining room and he didn't want them to get suspicious. After he got over to her, she smiled at him and he hated to inform her that there was a thief, but he had to, even if there was no chance of getting his money back. He got close enough that with his voice pitched low, she should be the only one to hear him. "Ms. Teresa, I hate to tell you this, but it seems that there is a thief in your inn. I had a small pile of copper in my dresser drawer and it's gone now. I don't expect you to reimburse me, but I do feel that you might want to look into some of your guests a bit closer." As he said this, her smile never wavered and he was just starting to get suspicious. Then just as she opened her mouth to reply, there was a clatter of wooden bowls from inside the kitchen behind Teresa. Both Teresa and Ryuji turned at the sudden racket and a very flustered Karen came rushing out with the beginnings of tears in her eyes. As she came skidding around the corner of the kitchen doorway, she looked frantically till she locked eyes with Ryuji, and then she rushed up to him and began wailing in a voice that was sure to draw attention. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for you to get there first. I mean, well, it's my fault. I'm so sorry, please don't think that way about the other guests." Teresa laid a hand on her shoulder and shook her slightly. "Calm down, girl. Just tell him straight and I'm sure he'll forgive you. But take a breath first." As Karen was calming down, Teresa reached into her apron and extracted several coins and held them out to the now thoroughly confused Ryuji. When Karen began speaking, she was calmer, but she still had tears at the corners of her eyes. When I was cleaning earlier, I opened your room to clean it and I saw the drawer open and a pile of copper in it. I didn't think that was safe to keep it that way, so I brought it down to the owner to change into larger coins. I was going to catch you before you went to your room and tell you, but I guess you got there first and. Ruji accepted the coins with a smile and shook his head. In all, there were 2 small silver coins, 6 large copper, and 3 small copper coins. After counting them, he looked back at Teresa just as she began to speak again. You should be more careful, lad. It's not safe to keep coin lying around, even in a locked room. Fortunately, Karen here is an honest girl, but if someone else had wandered into your room and seen that. Well, they say that coin is the enemy of honest men. I suppose that goes for women too, but you got lucky it was her, is all I can say about that. I certainly couldn't have paid you back for it if it got stolen, not even out of one of my rooms. Ruji looked at both of them and there was only one thing that seemed to fit the situation. He backed up a few steps and bowed low to each of the women in turn. As Ruji rose from the bow, he noticed that they both looked bewildered, but Karen looked absolutely aghast and was blushing a deep crimson. He couldn't help himself and had to tease her a little bit, so he leaned in and spoke in a very soft tone into her ear. I can't thank you enough. I was quite concerned when I discovered the money missing, but if I had known it was you, I would gladly have parted with it. I am truly thankful for your honesty though, absolutely grateful from the bottom of my heart. He put special emphasis on the last word and sure enough it had the desired effect as Karen had the dreamiest look on her deeply flushed face. He smiled at her again and went back upstairs to his room. The whole time he was in her field of vision and for some moments after, Karen just watched Ruji with that dreamy face. In turn, Teresa watched the young girl with a giant grin on her craggy old face. As much as she had enjoyed the show, they had customers to attend to and chores to be taken care of. As the old innkeeper cleared her throat, Karen jumped and looked at her in embarrassment before scurrying off into the kitchen with her head bowed while the old lady just chuckled. As Ruji got back to his room, he breathed a sigh of relief and closed his door. At least he wasn't robbed twice, he thought as he sat on his bed in utter exhaustion. He then remembered the look on Karen's face and had to smile. She was so easy to tease. On the other hand, when he thought about it, he realized that she didn't think he was teasing her. Maybe he had a shot with her. After all, he wasn't Ruji the high school B-team soccer player, he was Ruji the tall handsome elf and a noble at that. He then went to put the coin still in his hand into the sole remaining pouch on his belt only to discover that the infinite coin pouch was right where it should be. Then he remembered what the Youma had told him at the time. The pouch couldn't be stolen from him. That got him to wondering if his pendant was the same way, could it be stolen? He didn't have an answer, but he was just utterly relieved. Sure, he was sore from being kicked repeatedly and they took the other pouch with a handful of small copper in it, but so what? Relief flooded into Ruji, and he quickly stashed his coins in the pouch and took off his damp clothing to dry. He then went to pulling coins from his infinite pouch to fill his satchel, but he got a surprise. When he stuck his fingers into the fancy pouch, he found 2 coins in there. After fishing them out, he wondered if he had left an extra coin in it when the thugs robbed him. He didn't ponder this long though, and went back to his task only to find 2 coins in it again. The pouch was now producing 2 small copper at a time. He had leveled up somehow. Well, if this was like a game, that is. He quickly filled the satchel full and tested its weight. It was heavy, but not too bad. He certainly wouldn't want to carry this around town, but if he could just make straight for a bank, he should be all right. He decided that he would ask Karen about that as well as all the other places he wanted to go to. He began ticking off a list of things he needed but soon got distracted by thoughts of what he could buy to thank her. Finally, Ruji just gave up and just got dressed again in his only slightly damp clothing. Shaking his head, he made his way downstairs to find out about food and perhaps a few beers. He wasn't old enough to drink, but this body probably was, and he was going to want the alcohol as a painkiller for later when he wanted to go to sleep. Ruji descended the stairs and found his way to the bar and sat on one of the stools. A moment later, Karen came out and looked around. When she spotted Ruji at the bar, she rushed over. "Can I get you some dinner? We have sautéed vegetables and fish." "Oh wait, I guess you probably don't want any fish. I'm sorry I brought you meat in your soup yesterday. I forgot that elves don't eat meat. Oh, also, Lisbeth brought an order of sweet bread that she said you ordered. We still had some left from yesterday." Ruji smiled at her flustered manner of speech and responded once she seemed to wind down. "I really don't mind the meat. You could say I've grown kind of fond of it, but don't say anything to any other elves about it. They would think there was something wrong with me. And as far as the sweetbread goes, I took a liking to it and I really enjoy talking with Lisbeth, so I ordered some more. As I said, I like to have something sweet after my meal, but then I suppose I could just talk with you for a bit. That would have the same effect." She blushed and mumbled something as she rushed off to the kitchen. Ruji had to marvel at this. It was a totally new sensation to have a girl be interested in him. He was enjoying the teasing, but if he actually had a chance with her, he decided he wanted to pursue that. He had wanted to get her to tell him about some of the places around town, but he soon got a better idea. When he talked to her about it, he was going to steer towards a date. After going to a bank tomorrow, he would have more than enough to take her on a proper date and buy her a proper present. Karen returned from the kitchen with a tray containing a plate billowing steam. Apparently, the food was very fresh out of the oven, but that made sense since it wasn't even dark yet outside. She brought the tray over to him with a smile on her face, and when she began unloading the tray, there were 2 meals and she set one on the other side of the bar, presumably for herself. The plates contained a decent-sized piece of seared fish of some kind, a big portion of sautéed vegetables, and a couple small buttered buns of bread. Ruji looked at the offered food and his mouth began to water. He wasn't used to eating great food like this. At home, his dad worked all the time and his mom was sick in the hospital most of the time. That just left him and his older sister who was in college. His sister Haruko was a very nice person, but one thing she was not, was a cook. Most of the time they ate ramen, but once in a while she would try to cook something. Generally she would mess it up so bad they ended up eating ramen anyway. At the thought of his parents and sister, a tear formed in the corner of his eye. When she saw it, Karen started to get flustered and looked like she was about to start apologizing, so he spoke up quicker. "No, it's not you. I just remembered something from my past. I had a sister, and my parents were never home, so she would try to cook and would mess up. I just don't know what happened to my family, and I don't know if I had any other family or friends. I have to thank you as this is my first memory of my past." Karen looked concerned but smiled anyway. "The meal looks wonderful. Thank you for sharing a meal with me. I see that there was some butter left. Good, this bread is wonderful with butter on it, and I'm sure it will all taste better with your company." On cue, she blushed a deep crimson and stammered out a thank you. The food was marvelous. Rarely did Ruji eat this good. There were times when his dad would return home from work with some good news and take the family out to eat dinner. Most of the time that was because his mother had been released from the hospital. There were also a few times the school would have some events, like the school cultural festival. At those times they would have pretty good food and Ruji could eat at the stand he was working at. Ruji struggled with using the carved wooden fork because it was so different from the chopsticks he was used to using. A couple times during the meal, Karen had to get up and serve one of the other patrons, but when she came back to sit with him, Ruji could feel cold glares from the other male patrons. As they were enjoying their sweet bread after the meal, Ruji struck up the intended conversation. "I was wondering, do you know where the bank is? I need to exchange a bit of coinage." At first, she looked at him a little weirdly, but then she smiled and nodded. "I'm not sure what banku means, but I know where the money changer is." "Is that what you wanted? I can tell you how to get there. You just turn right after exiting the inn and..." Ruji was quick to interrupt her. "Well, the thing is, I get lost kind of easily because I'm not used to this city yet. I was hoping that maybe you could show me where it is. I also wondered where I could buy some new clothes and a second pair of shoes. I was also thinking of maybe getting a sword just in case." I'm no good with one, that was proven painfully at the Mercenaries Guild today. I just figure that if I practice a bit I might get better at it. He noticed that Karen was staring at him with a worried look on her face. I know where to get all of that. I even know where to get the best swords in town, but are you sure that you want to be a mercenary? That's a pretty dangerous profession and I'd hate to see you get hurt. Ruji smiled to himself. Karen certainly looked like she hated the thought of him getting hurt. Actually, now that he thought about it, he really didn't hurt. He realized that he should be in a lot of pain from the beating he took earlier, but he didn't feel any aches or pain whatsoever. He resolved to look into that a bit later, but for now, he needed to turn the conversation into a date. Well, I don't plan on rushing into anything too hazardous, at least not till I get a lot better. I do appreciate your help though, so again I was wondering if you could show me around. I wouldn't mind buying a few things for you as well. I bet you would look lovely in a new dress and some new shoes, not that you aren't lovely now, but I would like to see you in something like that. What do you think? There was the blush back. She ducked her head as her cheeks got even brighter and she continued on in a small stammering voice. Ruji thought to himself that she was adorable. IW would really like that. I can take off after lunch is served tomorrow. There usually aren't that many people here at that time since it costs extra and a lot of people here are working at that time of day. Ruji mentally patted himself on the back, it had worked perfectly. He was going on a date tomorrow after lunch. This was the first time since primary school he had been on a date, and that was just him going with a girl to play on the swings in the park near his house. Now he had only one item of business to take care of before tomorrow's date. I have one more thing I wanted to ask of you. Could I perhaps get you to store this here? He sat the satchel on the counter with a leaden thump. I'm afraid it's a bit heavy to keep carrying around all day, and as it's going to be after lunch before we even go to the money changer. As Teresa pointed out, it's not that safe to keep it in my room, and I kind of got the impression earlier that it might not be that safe to carry it all around with me either. Karen gulped as she looked at the satchel that was obviously brimming with coins of some kind. She realized that even if it was all in small copper, that it was easily several small gold coins worth. She shook her head a little stiffly before continuing. I'll have to ask Teresa if we can store it in the safe. I don't think that would be safe for you to carry around either. Ruji then went on with the last thing he wanted to do before retiring to his room for the evening. He was going to start his apprenticeship tomorrow, so he wanted to get plenty of sleep and show up early. He reached into his pouch and found one of the coins he was after and laid the large copper on the table in front of Karen. Here, this is as thanks for all of your help today. I really appreciate it and I look forward to tomorrow. When she laid eyes on the coin, her eyes grew wider and she began to shake her head. I can't accept this much. That's as much as I make in an 8-day of work, not that I don't get compensated fairly. Teresa gives me a room and I eat meals free, so it's more than enough, but still, I think that a large copper is a little too much, don't you? Ruji was a little surprised that she was making so little, but it did make sense if room and board were included in her pay. He nodded and slid the coin back into his pouch and she visibly relaxed, but he wasn't done yet. Well, if that's too much, I suppose it can't be helped. I guess I'll give you this instead. As he said that, he placed a stack of 8 small copper coins on the counter and quickly turned away to get up and head for his room. Karen looked at the stack of small copper and she knew that he knew the amount was exactly the same. She caught a smile on his face as he turned to leave, and she knew right away that he did it on purpose. He was flirting with her after all. Did that make tomorrow a date? He had told her that he would buy her a dress and shoes. Her heart began to flutter at the thought of escorting the tall handsome elf around town. She could feel her knees getting weak and other parts of her began to react accordingly. Karen couldn't remember the last time that a guy had shown this kind of interest in her. She had been strong since she was a child, and a lot of the boys began to get scared of approaching her. It was a reasonable thing since she was the oldest of 4 siblings and they were all orphans. She began to work early on and was stronger than other girls her age. Between being an orphan with nothing to offer in family ties and the intimidating presence that she cultivated to keep her 2 little sisters and little brother safe, she wasn't the most approachable girl. That only got worse as she got older, but here was a handsome and rich guy showering her with praise and gifts. It was a dream come true. Karen pocketed the tip that Ruji had left for her, feeling her heart aching the whole time as she put the coins in her apron. She then remembered the satchel and picked it up to go ask Teresa about using the safe. As she went to move it, she realized just how heavy it was when she nearly dropped it. She took it into the back of the kitchen and up the stairs to the owner's room. She knocked on the door to Teresa's living area. As she was waiting for the innkeeper to open her door, she decided to have a peek and was astounded once again at the volume of coins filling the medium-sized satchel to the very brim. When Teresa opened her door, she was met with the sight of Karen staring wide-eyed into an open satchel filled almost to spilling with shiny copper coins. It was such an odd sight that for a second she didn't register what was going on. Then realization dawned on her and she whistled. "I knew your boyfriend was loaded, but isn't that a little excessive? Well, don't just stand there, come in. I guess you need to put that in the safe box. Makes me wonder yet again why he chose to stay here when I knew from the start that he could afford to stay anywhere in the city he wanted to." At first, Karen started to protest about the boyfriend comment, but then she realized that was exactly the case now, wasn't it? She got a glow in her cheeks as she went into the owner's rooms and began recounting the events that had just taken place. Surprisingly, she wasn't the only one that was blushing. Karen realized that the owner had more of a romantic streak than she had thought. Even though she had to be quick so that they could get back down to the customers that would be waiting on their evening meal, the two shared a good giggle and Teresa promised that Karen would look properly presentable for her date tomorrow. As Karen descended the stairs to go back to work, Teresa put the incredibly heavy satchel in her iron safe box. After replacing the key to its proper hiding place, she then began rummaging through her closet. Karen was a little taller than she had ever been, but they used to be about the same waist and bust size, so the older woman knew that she still had a few things that would fit the girl in her wardrobe. She pulled things out of her wardrobe to try on Karen later. She considered this like a mother finding a good dress to send her daughter off in to try to help her get a marriage partner. She was having so much fun, but she never had any children because her husband was sent to war and died before they had any children. She also knew that Karen's father died in the war and her mother died of heartache a short time after. In some ways, it seemed like fate that the girl had ended up working for her. Then, at last, she found it, the dress that she knew she had to give to Karen to wear on her date. She was glad that she was finally going through her wardrobe. She could give the girl all of her old clothes as a wedding present. First, she would need to wash these because the strong herbs put in the closet to deter bugs from eating them had left their smell all over the clothes. Now she just had to teach the poor thing how to reel her prints in and seal the deal. That next morning Ruji awoke early just as he had hoped. He washed with the pot of water and linen left outside the privy, then he got dressed in his clothing that was starting to smell a tad rancid. He decided he would have to do something about that before he went on his date. He considered trying to wash them, but he really wanted to get to the shop early and he didn't have a change of clothes to put on while he was doing that. If he had a change of clothes, it wouldn't be an issue, to begin with. A thought came to mind and he sat on the bed for a few seconds considering how best to go about things. While he was out in the market yesterday, he had seen a lot of exotic items for sale and one of those was fragrances. He decided that he would go by the market at lunchtime and see about getting a cologne or something like that to use on the date. He certainly didn't fancy the idea of walking around on their date smelling the way he did now. With his new plan all set, he raced down the stairs and found a somewhat tired-looking Teresa serving sweetbread to people for breakfast. He walked over and she got a big grin on her face. He didn't have to ask what the grin was about, he knew perfectly well that she was cheering the two of them on from the sidelines. He took a couple pieces of the bread and hurried off with a quick thanks. As he was heading out, he heard one of the very young patrons complaining about him getting 2 pieces and Teresa shutting them up with a quick, "Did you buy the bread?" "No." "He did, so be grateful he's sharing it with you at all." She was a great person to know. He made his way to the magic shop, but he found it closed. He tried knocking loudly and even yelled for the old dwarf, but to no avail. After a couple minutes of him stalking restlessly in front of the shop, a passerby stopped and spoke to him. "It's no use, sir. The old man who owns the shop never wakes up this early. Powerful wizards get to set their own schedules, you know. The old man in there may not look it, but he's actually a very powerful wizard. If you have any other errands, you may as well do those first and come back in a bit. If you don't believe me, go near the window just there, you should be able to hear him snoring clear as day." "I know, because I pass by this way every day." As the man was walking off, Ruji thanked him, and now that he thought about it, he listened and he didn't have to go to the window. The old dwarf was snoring so loud that he could be heard faintly all the way at the front of the shop. Then he remembered two things in quick succession. First, elves are supposed to have good hearing, and second, was that he wanted to go by the market anyway. He made his way to the market and peered around a bit until he found just the lean-to stall that he was after. The woman that was setting all of the things out seemed to be some kind of beast folk. She had a tawny coat of fur all over her, and she wore a shirt and skirt that gave away her general shape, which left little doubt about her gender. Her species was a bit harder to place. She seemed to have small round ears on top of her head and an elongated muzzle, but nothing really gave him any real clues. He decided it wasn't that important and approached the stand. As soon as he walked up, she greeted him and started extolling the virtues of her wares. He ended up buying a bottle of a type of cologne that she swore was popular with humans, and as a bonus sale, she sold a bottle of perfume and a bar of laundry soap. All told, he ended up spending 1 small silver and 2 small copper. He was just glad that he didn't have to count it out in small copper, because that would have been embarrassing. As he walked away from the stall with his loot, he realized that his satchel was currently full of coins, so he made a trip to the back corner. The old gray cat was just arriving, but merrily let Ruji rummage till he found a satchel and another coin pouch. He then commented on how much he was buying from him and how it was nice to see repeat customers, but that he wasn't expecting somebody to repeat their business that soon. Ruji chuckled and paid him and was about to walk off when he remembered the bathing cloak and bought one of those as well, just on principle. He told the old cat he would come by that evening and pick it up, and the old cat told him he could deliver larger items if he wanted. It was common knowledge among people of this world, or perhaps just people of this city, that you could have your purchases delivered. The old gray cat told him that it was normally 2 small copper to have things delivered, but that he was a good enough customer that he didn't mind doing it for free. After telling the old guy where he was staying, which shocked the old catman, Ruji left. The old guy wasn't too surprised to find 2 random small copper coins laying on a crate beside him, but the idea that an affluent elf might stoop to staying in such a normal inn did surprise him. He just grinned. When he got back to the shop, it still wasn't open, but he could hear rustling in the back and no snoring. He went to the door and knocked, and a few moments later, the old dwarf opened the door and told him to come in. When he stepped into the shop, he noticed a smell that he loved. It was the scent of cooking bacon. The dwarf bustled off into the back and Ruji followed him. The old guy was cooking a batch of thick bacon and had a handful of eggs lined up beside the pan. It was all being cooked over an oven unlike any he had ever seen. The cooktop was similar to a lot of old cast iron ovens he was used to seeing, but what lay under that was completely different. The cooktop was supported on 4 corners by thick bands of iron, but they ran down to a plate under the center of the cooktop that had a glowing magic circle in it. Under the circle was a small basin tray, and the bars that supported the cooktop also split halfway down and veered outward to form 4 sturdy legs for the stove to stand on. As Ruji watched, the old dwarf stuck a finger in the basin on the bottom of the plate with the glowing magic circle. As Ruji watched, the old dwarf concentrated and the magic circle glowed bright orange until without warning fire sprouted from it that shot in a column all the way to the bottom of the cooktop. A few seconds later, the bacon started to sizzle and pop again, and the old dwarf leaned back away from the contraption and grabbed a spatula to stir the bacon. As fascinated as Ruji was, he was still starting to drool at the smell of the bacon. The dwarf prodded the bacon a couple times and flipped it to reveal a beautiful ripple pattern starting to form in the cooked portion that had been in the pan. Shortly after that, the old guy looked up at Ruji and seemed to almost flinch. He looked at Ruji's eyes carefully and looked where he was gazing and then spoke. "Oi, you look like you be cravin' me bacon. Don be tellin' me ya eat meat? Ain't never met a sun elf would touch a bit of meat. Ye don be wantin' some, do ya? Ruji recovered a bit from his daze, and just nodded his head with a smile. Then the old dwarf's words registered and he opened his mouth unsure what to say. You see. I don't know why, but I like meat, unlike any other sun elf I have heard of. Of course, that isn't many, because I don't remember past a couple days back. I came to on a hill overlooking the city and heard a bird squawking something that sounded like Ruji, and I've been calling myself that since then. I don't know who I am, but I remember some things, while others are just beyond me. The old dwarf pondered that for a moment and then seemed to come to a decision. He pulled back a corner of a towel to reveal a small pile of already cooked bacon and grabbed a piece. He handed it to Ruji, who thanked him and began to munch on it with bliss written all over his face. The old dwarf began chuckling, and that got Ruji's attention. It seemed the old guy wasn't convinced and was testing his new apprentice. Ruji almost felt like he was being mocked, but he didn't care because he had bacon. As he popped the last of the strip into his mouth, the old dwarf stopped what had become an actual belly laugh and looked at him, wiping a tear from his eye. Well, brand me arse with a hot iron, you really did eat it and seemed to like it something fierce. I never met me no elf like ya. I think we're gonna get along better than I was a thinkin'. How's about that, an elf what likes meat? Huh. Ruji grinned, but then something came to mind. Hey, I have an idea. I'll be right back. Won't take but a moment. Ruji almost said minute, but then caught himself realizing that such a measure of time didn't seem to exist here. Asterisk, I'm going to get us some buttered bread if you don't mind me asking for an egg and some more of that heavenly bacon. The old dwarf had a very hearty laugh at this and just waved Ruji away because he couldn't catch his breath enough to speak. Ruji left the shop and practically ran to the plaza. Once he arrived, he went straight to the now familiar stand of Lisbeth the baker woman. He quickly bought a half-dozen of her buttered bread buns and paid her with a large copper, despite her protest, before racing off with his prize.